In the early 7th century, Central Asia was still overwhelmingly shaped by Iranian peoples and cultures. Across the region, various Middle Iranian languages were spoken, forming a complex linguistic landscape that reflected centuries of settled civilization. In Transoxania, a chain of Sogdian city-states thrived, bound together by trade, culture, and shared language. Although Sogdian remained dominant, especially in rural and mountainous areas, the influence of the powerful Sasanian Empire meant that knowledge of Middle Persian and Parthian likely existed in major urban centres. This cultural resilience ensured that Sogdian traditions endured for generations, leaving traces that would survive long after political changes reshaped the region. Further south, in Bactria along the upper Oxus River, political authority rested in the hands of successors to the Hephthalites. These rulers struggled to maintain control as new forces approached from the west. Among them, leaders such as Tarkan Nizak attempted to resist the advancing Muslim armies, fighting determined campaigns that ultimately failed. Meanwhile, in Khwarezm, an ancient Iranian civilization continued under its native Afrikid dynasty. Though their historical timeline remains uncertain, their legacy survived through later scholarly accounts. Beyond the settled agricultural zones, the northern steppes and deserts were inhabited by Turkic tribes, including the Karluks, Kimeks, Kipchaks, and Oghuz. These groups were already beginning to move into the fertile lands of Transoxania and Fergana, setting the stage for future demographic transformation. Religiously, Central Asia presented a striking mosaic rather than a unified belief system. In the Tarim Basin and East Turkestan, Buddhist traditions flourished in centres such as Khotan and Kocho, deeply rooted in Indo-Iranian culture. Buddhism also held a strong position in Bactria, where Balkh stood as a major spiritual centre with its renowned monastery. Yet in Sogdia, the influence of Buddhism had begun to fade. By the early 7th century, Zoroastrianism had become increasingly prominent, supported by the prestige and power of the Sasanian state. At the same time, Christianity had established a significant presence, with various branches spreading across Transoxania and Khwarezm. Other belief systems also coexisted, including Manichaeism, which found particular acceptance among certain Eastern populations, and smaller dualist movements that continued to circulate within urban environments. The prosperity of the region was closely tied to its geography. Major rivers such as the Amu Darya, Sir Darya, and Zarafshan nourished fertile agricultural zones, sustaining large populations and vibrant cities. These urban centres became hubs of long-distance trade, connecting Inner Asia with distant regions. Sogdian merchants established trading colonies far to the east in China, while others extended their reach westward toward the lands of southern Russia. This network of commerce helped maintain economic vitality, even as political authority remained fragmented. The arrival of Arab forces marked a turning point. After the fall of the Sasanian Empire, Arab armies began probing beyond the Oxus River in the mid-7th century. Early incursions were limited, as key crossings had yet to be secured. Only later did commanders begin launching more organised campaigns into Transoxania. By the late 7th century, Arab forces achieved notable victories, defeating local rulers and establishing a foothold in cities such as Bukhara. However, internal divisions within the Islamic world slowed further expansion. Civil conflicts and rival claims to leadership weakened momentum, allowing local powers to resist and even seek assistance from distant allies, including China, though such efforts proved ineffective. A more decisive phase began under the leadership of Qutayba ibn Muslim, who governed the eastern provinces in the early 8th century. Through a series of campaigns, he brought key cities under control, imposed tribute arrangements, and introduced Islamic institutions into the region. His forces subdued Bukhara and extended influence towards Samarkand, compelling local rulers into submission. He also confronted external threats, including incursions by Turkic powers, and dealt with lingering resistance from Hephthalite leaders. Despite these successes, his campaigns did not fully consolidate control, particularly in Khwarezm, where local culture endured despite military pressure. Following his death, Arab authority weakened significantly. Over the next 2 decades, a series of defeats and uprisings eroded earlier gains. Turkic forces allied with local Sogdian rulers inflicted serious setbacks, reducing Arab control to only a few strongholds. Stability was only partially restored later under another capable governor, who sought to address grievances among local populations, particularly those who had converted to Islam but continued to face unequal treatment. By easing tensions and negotiating with regional leaders, he managed to reassert a degree of control, though the situation remained fragile. At the same time, deeper political tensions were building within the Islamic world itself. The ruling Umayyad dynasty faced growing dissatisfaction from both non-Arab converts and segments of the Arab population. Social inequalities, tribal rivalries, and disputes over leadership created an unstable environment. Various movements emerged, each offering a different vision of authority and justice. Some called for a return to early principles of equality, while others supported leadership within the family of the Prophet. These divisions weakened the cohesion that had once sustained the empire's rapid expansion. The eastern province of Khorasan became the focal point of these tensions. Long-standing rivalries between tribal groups intensified, while local unrest continued to grow. Political authority became fragmented, with competing leaders and factions struggling for dominance. In this volatile environment, a new movement began to organize quietly, drawing support from a wide range of dissatisfied groups. Its leaders operated in secrecy, carefully building a network that would eventually challenge the existing order. By the mid-8th century, conditions had reached a breaking point. Armed conflicts between rival factions escalated, and the authority of the central government weakened further. Amid this chaos, a new leader emerged, skillfully navigating the complex political landscape. He united diverse groups under a common cause, appealing to shared grievances and promising change. His forces gradually gained strength, securing key territories and defeating opposing armies. Qahtaba stayed in Ray for about 5 months, and that pause gave the Iraqi governor Ibn Hubayra enough time to gather a major army. When the campaign resumed in the spring of 749, the road ahead was no longer open. Strong Syrian forces stationed in Isfahan and Nihavand stood in the way of the Abbasid advance. Qahtaba struck first. His main army defeated the force based at Isfahan, while his son laid siege to the troops holding Nihavand. After 4 difficult months, the defenders of Nihavand finally surrendered on June 26, 749. Ibn Hubayra then gathered a massive force and established himself at Jalula, waiting for Qahtaba to attack. At the same time, another Syrian army moved through northern Kurdistan, creating the danger of an attack from the rear. The Abbasid position looked extremely dangerous, and defeat seemed likely. Yet, Qahtaba managed to turn the situation in his favour. Through skillful manoeuvring, he drew Ibn Hubayra out of his protected camp and forced him into open ground, where his army lost the advantage. That single move broke the defensive plan. Ibn Hubayra could no longer organise an effective barrier against the Abbasid march toward Kufa. Even when Qahtaba himself was killed during an unexpected clash, the momentum of the campaign did not stop. His army, though deprived of its most gifted commander, continued forward. The Umayyads found only a small measure of relief in one late success. At last, they discovered the identity of the Abbasid imam and arrested him. But this came far too late to alter the course of events. The Abbasid army kept advancing and entered Kufa on August 29th, 749. The imprisoned Ibrahim was later executed by order of the Caliph. Yet before his death, he had already sent word that leadership should pass to his brother, Abu al-Abbas Abd Allah. This transfer of authority ensured continuity at the very moment when the movement needed it most. Abu al-Abbas, the future Caliph al-Safa, arrived secretly in Kufa together with relatives and trusted supporters. For several weeks, Abu Salama kept his presence hidden. He had his own political calculations and hoped to reach an agreement with an Alid claimant, handing over the victory to another branch of the Prophet's family. But none of the possible candidates accepted the offer. Once the hidden imam's presence became known among the Khurasani supporters, Abu Salama had little room left to maneuver. On November 28, 749, a formal ceremony was held and allegiance was sworn to Abu al-Abbas as the new caliph. In his first address, he spoke of peace and justice and tried to present the change of regime as the beginning of a new age. One of his first acts was to raise the soldiers' pay, a clear sign that the new Vlasti intended to reward those who had secured victory. Marwan II still made one final effort to save Umayyad rule. He personally took command of a large army and marched out to confront the Abbasid forces. The decisive encounter came on the banks of the Great Hazab. There, the Umayyad army suffered total defeat. Marwan fled westward into Syria, hoping perhaps that the old heartland of his dynasty would rally around him. But no meaningful support appeared. Driven onward by the advancing Abbasids, he continued south until he reached Upper Egypt. There, at Busir in the summer of 750, his flight ended and he was killed. With his death, the Umayyad Caliphate came to its final collapse in the central lands of the empire. Yet the triumph of the Abbasids quickly brought disappointment to many who had helped place them in power. Those who had joined the struggle under the banners of justice, reform, or loyalty to the Prophet's family soon understood that their own hopes would not define the new order. The Shiite groups and the Kharijites realized that their language and ideals had been used as tools in a broader political campaign. The promises of justice and reconciliation did not lead to universal prosperity. Instead, the new regime established itself through harsh discipline, executions, and calculated repression. The Abbasids were especially ruthless toward the Umayyad family. Every adult male who fell into their hands was killed. Even the dead were not spared. Graves were opened, remains were dug up, and vengeance was carried beyond death itself. After destroying their open enemies, the new rulers turned against some of their former allies, those who had become inconvenient, those who had shown the slightest disrespect, and those whose services made the caliphs feel dangerously indebted were gradually removed. Abu Muslim himself began settling accounts soon after victory. Ali al-Kirmani and his sons were among the earliest victims. Abu Salama, who had played such an important part in the transfer of power, was eliminated on the order of Abu al-Abbas. Sulaiman ibn Kathir also met a violent end. The revolution had devoured not only its enemies but many of the men who had helped carry it to success. The Shiites answered this betrayal with revolt. In the spring of 751, one of the most serious uprisings broke out in Bukhara, one of the key Arab strongholds in Transoxania. Its leader was Sharik ibn Sheikh, who declared that the family of Muhammad had not been supported, merely so that blood might continue to be shed and law broken. His message drew enormous support, and around 30,000 men rallied to his cause. The force sent against him under Ziyad ibn Salih might not have succeeded on its own. Victory became possible only because local support was divided. The Bukhar Hudat, the ruler of Bukhara, together with the Bukharan landed elite, assisted the Abbasid side in suppressing the rebellion. This revealed the uncertain position of the Iranian nobility in the east. Some local rulers chose accommodation and became reliable partners of the new dynasty, especially when promised equality with Arab Muslims in return for accepting Islam. Others tried to use the confusion among Arab factions as an opportunity to regain independence. These efforts were encouraged by intervention from China, whose rulers were pursuing an active Western policy at precisely this time. In 748, while Abu Muslim's forces were still hunting Nasr ibn Sayyar, Chinese troops advanced and destroyed Suyab, the former center of the Yellow Turgesh Khagan. At the same moment, the Chinese commander Gao Xianji was extending influence across the Pamirs and the Upper Indus region, bringing smaller principalities under control. 2 years later, he appeared in eastern Transoxania, after being invited by the ruler of Ferghana to assist against the ruler of Chach, the city later known as Tashkent. The ruler of Chach was captured, sent away, and executed. His son then turned to the Arabs for help. Abu Muslim responded by dispatching Ziyad ibn Saleh, while he himself established a base in Samarkand. The Arab forces moved toward Talas, also known as Taraz, where at first they found themselves under pressure. Reinforcements from Abu Muslim changed the situation and allowed them to take the offensive. In July 751, they met a Chinese army said to number 30,000 men. The battle turned on a sudden and decisive shift. The Karluks rose against the Chinese from the rear, and the Chinese army found itself attacked from two sides at once. The result was catastrophe. The force was destroyed, and its commander escaped only with difficulty, protected by a small guard as he fought through the chaos of retreat. The victors captured immense booty and many prisoners. Among those taken were skilled silk weavers and paper makers. The weavers were sent west to work in the caliph's textile workshops in Kufa. The papermakers remained in Samarkand, where their skills helped establish a local paper industry. In time, that industry would play a major role in the wider spread of writing, copying, and book production throughout the Muslim world. At the same time, Abu Muslim tightened his grip on the region through relentless force. Sogdiana was subdued with fire and violence. In the south and east, Khalid ibn Ibrahim, governor of Balkh, invaded Hutal. Its ruler fled first to Ferghana and then onward to China. Khalid then pushed north toward Kish, where he defeated and killed its ruler as well. By now, Abu Muslim stood as the unquestioned master of Khorasan and Transoxania. He commanded a loyal army greater in effectiveness than anything the Caliph himself controlled. That very success made him dangerous. The Caliph tried to weaken him by encouraging a rebellion led by Ziyad ibn Saleh, who had become governor of Bukhara and Sogdiana. But most commanders remained loyal to Abu Muslim. Ziyad fled and later died while hiding under the protection of a local landowner. The failure of this scheme only increased tension. The Caliph's brother, Abu Jafar, then resolved that Abu Muslim must be removed at the next possible opportunity. That opportunity came in 754. Abu Jafar al-Mansur became Caliph after the death of Abu al-Abbas al-Safa, and circumstances soon gave him a chance to act. Abu Muslim had once again proven his loyalty by crushing a revolt led by the new Caliph's uncle. Afterward, al-Mansur demanded that the booty from the campaign be handed over. When Abu Muslim came to seek an explanation, he walked into a trap. On the Caliph's order, he was killed. So ended the career of the man the Abbasids themselves had once called the guardian of their dynasty. The soldiers who had accompanied Abu Muslim were pacified with money. Each man received 1,000 dirhams, and the army accepted the news. In Khorasan, however, the reaction was far more explosive. There, Abu Muslim's death was not seen as a routine act of power politics, but as a deep betrayal. A Zoroastrian figure named Sunbad rose in rebellion to avenge him. The uprising spread across northern Persia from Nishapur to Ray. It lasted 70 days before being crushed with great brutality. The repression was so extensive that women and children were killed alongside the men, showing that this was not simply a military mutiny, but a broad, popular movement. The seriousness of the revolt can also be measured by the fact that so many troops were required to put it down that the usual summer campaign against Byzantium in Anatolia had to be abandoned that year. The strong reaction to Abu Muslim's murder revealed how varied and unstable the movement he had led had always been. It had begun in Arab Muslim circles, but over time it drew in many different groups, divided by class, ethnicity, and religious outlook. Some had accepted Islam sincerely, others only outwardly, yet many brought with them older beliefs and concepts shaped by their own local traditions. In the teachings of radical Shiite groups, ideas began to appear that did not belong to the original religious spirit of Islam. One of these was the belief that a divine force could become present in a chosen leader and pass from one person to another through inheritance. In certain circles, reverence for the Imam began to resemble worship of a human being, as though he were divine. This was a direct break with the central Islamic insistence on the absolute uniqueness of God. The Rwandiya, a group sometimes associated with Abu Muslim, was said to believe so strongly in the divine status of al-Mansur that they interpreted even the commander of his guard as an angelic being. Such conduct was deeply scandalous to Orthodox Muslims. When members of the sect later surrounded the caliph's palace in Iraq in an act of devotion, al-Mansur ordered them dispersed and, if necessary, killed. These beliefs were often linked with the idea that souls could pass from one body to another. In such a worldview, not only divine light, but the spirit of any revered leader might continue in a new human form. Under these conditions, the idea of the imamate became detached from its original claim that legitimate rule belonged within the family of Ali. Abu Muslim himself became the focus of this kind of devotion. One group held that after death, he had become the true imam. Others disagreed only over who inherited his role. Still others refused to believe he had died at all and expected his return. Such expectations encouraged fresh rebellions, led by figures claiming to carry on his mission. Later, writers often connected Abu Muslim with the so-called wearers of white, a movement associated with white garments or banners, and sometimes linked to neo-Mazdakite ideas. White could symbolize purity, but it also stood in clear contrast to the Abbasid black. Their teachings reportedly included social equality, communal ideals, and belief in reincarnation. Yet the connection between these groups and the followers of Abu Muslim is highly uncertain. Medieval authors often grouped very different sects together simply because they looked similar from the outside. Their descriptions rarely show clear understanding of what these groups actually believed. For that reason, the identification cannot be accepted with confidence. By all outward signs, Abu Muslim presented himself as an Orthodox Muslim. Yet the first major avenger of his death was a Zoroastrian priest. Another rebel associated with his cause, Ishaq the Turk, declared himself a follower of Zoroaster and announced that justice would soon come to the world through a returning saviour. In 757, the Abbasid commander in the region and his successor, Khalid ibn Ibrahim, were killed by followers of Ishaq. Not long afterward, another governor, Abd al-Jabbar, who had earlier punished Shiite agitators, rose in revolt himself and formed an alliance with the wearers of white under their leader, Baraz Banda. Even so, despite these rebellions, Abbasid rule in Khorasan and Transoxania gradually became secure. Its authority was strong enough that Arab troops from the eastern frontier are mentioned in Chinese records as assisting in the suppression of a rebellion in China during the years 757 and 758. At the same time, the Turgesh, who had fought for nearly 20 years to drive the Arabs from Transoxania, were weakened by constant internal conflict. In 766, they were displaced by the Karluks, who took over their grazing lands in Semirekye. Power in the steppe was shifting, and the balance of the region changed with it. One of the main reasons for greater stability in Transoxania was the changing attitude of the local landed elite toward Muslim rule. The Abbasid rise was not simply a dynastic replacement. It reshaped the social and military foundations of the caliphate. Most importantly, it began to erode the old Arab monopoly of privilege and moved toward granting equal political standing to all Muslims, whether Arab or non-Arab. Some Iranians even came to believe that the Abbasids planned to eliminate Arab power entirely in Khorasan. Stories circulated that the Abbasid leadership had once ordered Abu Muslim to kill all Arabs in the province. There is no reliable evidence for such a command, but the rumour itself shows how dramatically people believed the balance of power had changed. In Syria and Upper Mesopotamia, the army from Khorasan treated local Arabs loyal to the Umayyads as enemies, and one Christian historian later described how these eastern troops slaughtered Arabs like sacrificial animals. The consequences of this transformation were not the same everywhere. In Iran proper, much of the native nobility and bureaucracy had already entered the Islamic State before the Abbasid Revolution and had long since converted. These men readily supported the new dynasty. In Transoxania, the first response had been resistance and attempted independence. But the destruction of Chinese hopes in the region and the severe punishments inflicted on rebellious landowners persuaded many leading Dekhans that reconciliation was the safer path. Gradually, they accepted the Abbasids as overlords and served them as loyal vassals. By this stage, many important posts in government were already being filled by men from Khorasan. They claimed precedence as veterans of the revolution and brought with them practical experience in administration, something many Transoxanian landowners lacked because they had governed only small domains in an older, more patriarchal style. Arabs still held many senior military commands, but in civil administration, Iranians and Tajiks steadily gained influence. From the earliest years of Abu al-Abbas, one of the most important departments of government, the bureau responsible for taxation and land revenue, was headed by Khalid ibn Barmak, the son of a former Buddhist temple chief from Balkh. He also became, in effect, the first true vizier of the caliphate. His office reflected a new level of administrative development. Whether this was a revival of older Iranian models or an evolution from existing Arab practice, the result was the same. Government became more organized, more professional, and more dependent on trained officials. The decision to found a new capital in Iraq revealed just how far the Abbasids intended to move away from the old Umayyad world. The earlier dynasty had looked westward, towards Syria and the broader Mediterranean sphere, but the Abbasids chose a different direction. Al-Mansur examined several possible locations before selecting a modest settlement called Baghdad on the western side of the Tigris, not far upstream from the ruins of the former Sasanian capital at Ctesiphon. In 762, work began on what would officially be known as the City of Peace. From the very beginning, this new capital was not a provincial centre but a meeting place of peoples. Al-Mansur's army, numbering around 30,000, included soldiers from many parts of Iran, especially from Khorasan. The craftsmen and labourers who built the city came from across the Near East. Its local population, speaking Aramaic and some Persian, mixed with Arabs from Kufa, Basra, and Wasit. Districts of the growing city even took their names from places in Transoxania, reflecting the presence of troops from those lands. In this crowded and diverse setting, a new Muslim urban culture slowly emerged, shaped by many peoples and eventually expressed through different language traditions. The contrast between the Abbasid court and the older Umayyad style was dramatic. Compared with the vast luxury of the new rulers and the large circles surrounding them, the Umayyad way of life could almost seem restrained. The expense of maintaining the caliph's court was enormous, matching the entire tax income of a major province. Such wealth had to be sustained, and the financial administration searched tirelessly for more revenue. Land registers were reviewed, and taxes were raised in several parts of the Near East. Yet there is no clear sign that the same policy was immediately imposed in Khorasan and Transoxania during the first phase of Abbasid rule, even though taxation there was already a difficult matter. In many districts of those eastern lands, taxes were collected according to fixed agreements that named only the total amount owed by a region. It was then left to local landowners to distribute the burden among the people. As more inhabitants converted to Islam, the pool of those liable for the poll tax shrank, and the duties that could be collected from Muslim merchants and craftsmen were also limited. The missing portion was often shifted onto non-Muslims. On top of that, the authorities could demand extra payments whenever they wished. This created a new divide in society. The main line of tension was no longer between Arab and non-Arab, but between Muslim and non-Muslim. At the same time, older patterns of social thought that had once helped preserve stability were breaking down. Within a single generation, the Islamic world had changed beyond recognition. Institutions, loyalties, and expectations were all in flux. In such a climate, it was easy for radical movements and explosive slogans to take root. That atmosphere of unrest became especially visible in the rebellion led by Hashim ibn Hakim, better known as Al-Mukanna, the Veiled One. His revolt, which lasted 4 years, was one of the clearest signs of deep political, social, and religious dissent in the early Abbasid age. He came from a family linked to the movement of Abu Muslim, and had himself taken part in the rebellion of Abd al-Jabbar, supporting the belief that Abu Muslim was the rightful imam. After that rising was crushed, al-Mukanna ended up in prison in Baghdad, but he managed to escape and return eastward to his homeland near Merv. There, he began preaching an extraordinary message. He declared that the divine spirit once present in Abraham, Jesus, Muhammad, and Abu Muslim had now become embodied in him. Such claims did not impress those who knew him personally. People in his own homeland reacted with skepticism and refused to take him seriously. But farther east, in Transoxania, conditions were more favourable. Resentment was already strong there for many reasons. A colony of Manichaeans in Samarkand may have helped keep Neo-Mazdakite ideas alive, while the belief in the migration of souls may also have found a receptive audience in southern Transoxania, where Buddhist temples had only recently disappeared. By the spring of 776, emissaries sent out by al-Mukanna had stirred rebellion in the region of Kish, around the area of modern Kitab and Shar-e-Sabz. Hashim then moved there in person and established himself in a mountain fortress, high in the upper Kashgar Darya, choosing a site difficult to approach and even harder to storm. At the same time, the so-called Wearers of White had seized 2 small towns in the Bukhara oasis. Al-Mukanna also had supporters inside Samarkand, and that city too joined the uprising. A commander sent by the Caliph al-Mahdi to suppress the movement spent 4 months struggling unsuccessfully against the rebels in white before shifting his attention to Samarkand, which he did manage to occupy. But this success changed little. The rebellion remained strong. In the following year, the rebels controlled almost the entire Kashgar Darya valley, except for a few isolated towns. Their influence pushed southward toward Termez, where they inflicted a serious defeat on government troops, and with the backing of the Karluk Turks, they succeeded in occupying Samarkand once more. Muslim historians never fail to emphasize that al-Muqarna claimed divine embodiment, but they say much less about the social character of his movement. They accuse him of abolishing property and allowing sexual disorder. Yet there is no clear evidence that his followers systematically seized the wealth of the rich or targeted the landed nobility as a class. His revolt does not appear to have been directed primarily against landowners. Its broader tendency was anti-Islamic in the sense that it drew together nearly every force in Transoxania dissatisfied with the new dynasty and eager for one last attempt to restore older ways of life. This may explain why only a small number of the known supporters of al-Muqarna bore Muslim names. The fact that most major towns rejected his message suggests that the rebellion drew most of its strength from peasants and from people living in more isolated mountain districts, especially in the upper Kashgardaria, where pre-Islamic beliefs still remained strong. The war lasted 4 years and damaged Transoxania severely. Samarkand changed hands 3 times and must have suffered destruction on a scale not seen since the worst crisis of the 730s. Economic strain is visible in the coinage of the period, when debased silver dirhams began to appear under the names of local governors. But beyond material damage, the defeat of al-Muqarna marked a major turning point. It separated one age from another. With the collapse of his movement, Islam achieved a final and decisive victory in Transoxania. During the 30 years between the uprising of Abu Muslim and the fall of al-Muqarna, the country had been transformed. The Deccans lost their political importance. As early as 760, the ruler of Sogdiana had stopped minting his own coins, and the ruler of Bukhara did much the same. The Sogdian ruler disappeared from the historical stage altogether, while the ruler of Bukhara preserved only a shadow of authority. After he was executed for supporting the wearers of white, even his descendants sank to the level of ordinary landowners. Lesser Deccans became simple subjects of the new order. In the towns that had once functioned as autonomous city-states under Deccan leadership, the highest place was now taken by the Muslim military and administrative elite. These newcomers bought up the estates and palaces of the old local aristocracy, a process especially clear in Bukhara. Smaller towns that had once housed Deccans lost their purpose and declined into villages. At the same time, traders and craftsmen increasingly concentrated in the major urban centres, preferring to live close to the wealthy consumers supported by state salaries and official power. Language changed as well. In the larger towns, Arabic became increasingly prominent, while New Persian spread through the arrival of Iranian Muslims already integrated into the structures of the caliphate. Sogdian, once the language of urban culture and trade, was becoming obsolete. It survived for local use, but for anyone seeking advancement in the wider imperial world, especially in Baghdad, it offered little advantage. After crushing al-Muqarna's rebellion, the Abbasids were able to push their influence beyond the Sirdaria into lands long dominated by the Karluks, whose power at that time stretched as far as Kashgar. At the start of al-Mahdi's reign, troops were sent to Fergana, but unrest blocked any lasting success, and the Karluks soon pressed into the Samarkand region. Later, claims that distant rulers submitted to the caliph are difficult to trust, especially extravagant reports involving Tibet. What is more certain is that in 791, the Uyghurs defeated the Karluks near Beshbalik, and the governor Gitrif ibn Atta took advantage of the moment by sending forces into Fergana to drive the Karluks out. His successor, Fadl ibn Yahya al-Barmaki, secured formal recognition from the ruler of Fergana that he stood as a vassal of the caliph. Around the same time, he also sent troops against the Kabul Shah. The campaign produced substantial booty, and the army returned through Sistan. Fadl himself, being Iranian, proved able to work effectively with local dekhans. During his governorship, he raised a large militia known as the Abbasid militia, and part of this force was sent onward to Baghdad for service. The rebellion of al-Muqana also forced the governors of Khorasan to bring order to matters of taxation and irrigation. One governor reduced the land tax after it had been raised too high by his predecessor. He also corrected abuses in the Merv oasis, where members of the elite had seized more than their fair share of water for their own fields. Regulation of water distribution was extended to other regions as well. During this same period, work began on building a defensive wall around the entire Bukhara oasis, a project that would continue for decades. This relative prosperity did not last. It ended with the appointment of a new governor, Ali ibn Isa ibn Mahan, whose rule became notorious for exploitation. He squeezed the lands under his control without mercy. Complaints reached the Caliph Harun al-Rashid, but they achieved nothing because the governor's lavish gifts had already bought the loyalty of powerful figures at court. Yahya al-Barmaki tried to expose these abuses and force the caliph to see the truth, but Harun remained blinded by the wealth he was receiving. As oppression grew, rebellion followed. In 797, Sistan rose in revolt under the leadership of a Kharijite named Hamza, a local landowner who claimed descent from the legendary Iranian king Tahmasp. The son of Ali ibn Isa, sent to crush the uprising, was defeated. Other efforts also failed. In the end, only the capital of Sistan remained in government hands, while the rest of the province fell to the Kharijites, who rejected the caliph's authority and paid no taxes. Another revolt erupted in 799 at Nasr, near present-day Ashgabat. Its leader, Abu al-Hasib Wuhaib ibn Abd Allah, gained control over a wide stretch of Khorasan and even advanced as far as Merv, where the governor himself resided. It took until 802 for Ali ibn Isa to defeat and kill him. But an even more dangerous uprising broke out in 805. This one was led by Rafi ibn al-Layth, said to be a grandson of Nasr ibn Sayyar. It began with what seemed almost like a personal scandal. Rafi tried to marry a woman who was already married, was arrested, escaped, and then turned his private disgrace into open revolt by rallying the Ayar groups of Samarkand. The people of the city, already outraged by Ali ibn Isa's oppression, eagerly supported him. With their help, Rafi defeated the governor's son who had been sent against him. Soon all of Transoxania was backing the rebellion. At last, Harun al-Rashid accepted that the accusations against Ali ibn Isa had been justified. He appointed a new governor who arrested the old one and launched a campaign against Rafi. But earlier efforts to crush the revolt had already failed so badly that the caliph decided to lead the struggle in person. He set out toward Merv, but never arrived. In 809, on the road east, Harun al-Rashid died at Tus, and with his death another great turning point in the history of the Eastern Caliphate began. After the death of Harun al-Rashid, the Caliphate effectively split into two spheres of power. In the west, authority belonged to the Caliph al-Amin, while in the east, his brother al-Ma'mun controlled Khorasan and the lands beyond it. Faced with unrest in Transoxania, al-Ma'mun chose a practical solution instead of a long and destructive campaign. He reduced the land tax by 1/4 and opened negotiations with Rafi ibn al-Layth. Once Rafi received a pardon and was recognized as governor of Transoxania, the rebellion quickly lost its energy. The reduction in taxation eased tensions, and many local landowners from Khorasan joined the effort to restore order, each bringing his own armed followers. Among those who supported al-Ma'mun were 4 brothers from the Samanid family of the Balkh region. their loyalty would later be richly rewarded. About a decade afterward, when al-Ma'mun had become caliph, they were granted hereditary authority over Fergana, Chach, and Herat. From that moment, the foundations of Samanid power in Transoxania were laid. The reign of al-Ma'mun marked the beginning of a slow but important weakening of central control. Although his forces defeated and killed al-Amin in 813, al-Ma'mun did not immediately move west. He remained in Merv for another 5 years, and this prolonged residence in the east shaped the political future of the empire. He was the son of Harun al-Rashid and an Iranian slave mother, and this background placed him close to the Iranian elite, who increasingly dominated both administration and military affairs. His government trusted the management of vast provinces to powerful men from Khorasan. In 821, Tahir ibn al-Hussein was appointed to govern all of Persia, and after his death the position passed to his son. In this way, the Tahirids came to control the region for about half a century. The caliphate still looked united on the surface, but power was already becoming more regional, more personal, and less dependent on the direct hand of the caliph. The Abbasid Empire held together a population of many languages, religions, and ethnic groups, and its unity rested above all on military force. Maintaining that force consumed most of the state's resources. During the Abbasid age, the old Arab armies that had once carried conquest across the Middle East were gradually replaced. In their place came a more professional military structure, supported by militias raised from Persian landowning families loyal to the dynasty. Over time, these Iranian-backed forces displaced the older tribal levies, which were now called up only for especially large campaigns. The caliphs themselves had no reliable ethnic or social base of their own. Only senior officials were truly attached to the imperial system, and even their loyalty was directed more toward the machinery of government than toward the ruler personally. This made the caliphs increasingly dependent on troops that might grow too powerful or too independent. To escape that danger, they searched for soldiers whose loyalty would rest entirely on personal service. The answer was found in military slaves. Slaves had served as guards even in earlier Islamic times, but only toward the end of al-Ma'mun's reign did they begin to form the core of the caliph's armed power. This development accelerated under his successor al-Muqtasim, who purchased thousands of Turkish slave soldiers and turned them into the nucleus of a new army. These men were trained professionals, detached from local loyalties and tied directly to the ruler. At first, they gave the caliph a stronger personal military instrument. In time, however, the system produced a dangerous reversal. Later, caliphs, surrounded by these armed servants, often became dependent on them and finally vulnerable to their influence. Men bought to protect the throne would eventually help control it. Even with these internal changes, the inclusion of Khorasan and Transoxania within the caliphate had major consequences for the Eastern Islamic world. Integration into the empire brought these regions into closer commercial and cultural contact with the wider Muslim lands. Trade expanded, cities grew, and urban populations in Transoxania increased noticeably from the late 8th century onward. The towns of the region became more deeply connected to the economic life of the Islamic world, and this encouraged new forms of prosperity. Yet the rise of an Iranian Muslim civilization also carried losses. Older written traditions in Middle Persian, Khwarezmian, and Sogdian declined, and much of that literary heritage disappeared. In art as well, the old tradition of large-scale wall painting and monumental visual expression faded away. Cultural integration opened new doors, but it also erased much that had belonged to the earlier Iranian world. At the same time, the political and religious unrest that had shaken the eastern provinces did not vanish. Islam had arrived with a universal message, promising a social order in which believers of every background would stand equal before God. In practice, however, the earliest Islamic empire had functioned largely as an Arab imperial state. As increasing numbers of Iranians, Central Asians, and other non-Arab peoples converted to Islam, they entered the Muslim community not as full equals, but as clients attached to Arab tribes or patrons. Their position was better than that of non-Muslims, but still clearly inferior to that of Arab Muslims. They often remained burdened by special taxes similar to those imposed on non-Muslim subjects, while Arab al-Muslimin were exempt. Such inequality ensured that resentment would continue to grow in the eastern provinces. From an early stage, then, the eastern lands of Islam became fertile ground for prolonged hostility toward Arab rule. This was especially true in remote regions like Khorasan and Transoxania, far from the main centers of caliphal authority in Syria and Iraq. Many populations there accepted Islam only gradually and often superficially. Beneath the new religious surface, older loyalties and beliefs remained strong. Different movements emerged, combining political rebellion with religious protest, and many of them led to open insurrection. Some were directed mainly against the caliphate, others against Arab privilege, and still others against Islam itself as it had come to be associated with foreign rule. These movements often drew strength from older Iranian traditions, including Zoroastrian and Mazdakite ideas, and they continued to appear under the early Abbasids and beyond. One of the earliest and most important oppositional currents to gain support in the Iranian world was Kharijism. More broadly, the eastern provinces also became receptive to the cause of the elites and to different forms of Shi'ism, which had first emerged among Arabs opposed to the established caliphate. By the 9th century, all the major branches of Shiite thought had followers in various parts of the Iranian lands. Alongside them appeared other sectarian movements, especially in Transoxania, Khorasan, and Azerbaijan. Many of these groups are gathered under the broad label of the Khurramiyya. Their ideas were often mixed and difficult to define, blending Iranian religious traditions with selected Islamic elements. Even so, their outlook generally remained hostile to Arab domination and suspicious of mainstream Islam. Much of their support came from the countryside. Villagers and smallholders often suffered not only from the state, but also from large landowners who had accommodated themselves to the new imperial order and acted as its local agents. In later generations, especially from the second half of the 9th century onward, the decline of firm Abbasid control allowed more durable expressions of Iranian political identity to emerge under new regional dynasties. But before that change took lasting shape, dissent often found its voice through sectarian revolt. The difficulty in understanding many of these movements lies in the poor quality of the surviving evidence. Very little from the sectarians themselves has come down to later generations. Most of what is known comes from authors who were hostile to them. Muslim historians and writers on religious divisions usually defended the legitimacy of the caliphate and the doctrines of Sunni Islam. And so, they described these opposition groups as heretics, rebels, or dangerous extremists. Shiite authors, though often better informed about internal rivalries, were also partisan and eager to refute competing branches. As a result, many of these groups are known only through sources that freely accuse them of scandalous beliefs, social disorder, or bizarre religious practices. Some of those accusations may preserve fragments of truth, but many clearly reflect hostility and misunderstanding. For several of these movements, especially the Khurrami groups, the full content of their teachings may never be known with certainty. Modern scholarship has made progress, but many debates continue, especially regarding their social base and economic grievances. Even so, the main outlines of their role in the Eastern Islamic lands can still be traced. Kharijism, the first major schism in Islam, had originally emerged from the struggle between Ali ibn Abi Talib and Muawiyah. the Kharijites broke away and formed their own vision of the Muslim community. They insisted that leadership should belong not to a particular family or tribe, but to any morally upright believer, even a man of the humblest background. This message of equality had obvious appeal among non-Arab converts, especially Persians, who resented Arab privilege. In the East, anti-Arab feeling could therefore attach itself to Kharijite activism. Yet the Kharijites were also divided among themselves. Their strict insistence on moral correctness led to endless fragmentation, and over time, the movement broke into many branches and sub-branches. From early Umayyad times onward, Kharijites from Iraq sought refuge in Persia and spread their ideas there. Sistan, in particular, became one of their most important centres, and for a long time, Kharijism remained the strongest sectarian current in that region. By the period of the Second Civil War, Kharijite communities were already firmly rooted in different parts of the Iranian lands, and many of them launched repeated rebellions against the caliphate. At first, the most active branch was the Azarika, one of the most radical factions of the movement. This group was known for its extreme doctrines and for allowing the killing even of the women and children of Muslims, who did not share their beliefs. As early as the late 7th century, they had already established communities in Fars and Kerman. Later, the movement in Iran was reorganized by Ibn Ajarad, who may have come from Balkh. He founded the Ajarida, a branch that seems to have been more moderate than the Azarika. Very little is known about him personally, but later writers mention a large number of subgroups within the Ajarida, many of them specific to Iran. These Ajarida branches became particularly active in Sistan and in the eastern provinces from the early 8th century onward. There, they developed more local roots and a distinct character. One of their important subdivisions, the Tha'aliba, contributed to the revolutionary unrest that shook Khorasan in the late Umayyad period. And for a time, some of them even supported Abu Muslim. Later, smaller splinter groups survived in places such as Juzjan. Even so, Sistan remained the chief eastern stronghold of Kharijism. It was there that one of the most important anti-Abbasid revolts of the period began under Hamza al-Khariji. Hamza came from a noble Persian landowning family and founded a subsect known as the Hamziya. His revolt started in Zarang, the capital of Sistan, and it drew strength from the anger of villagers burdened by taxation. He urged them to stop paying land tax and other dues to the caliph. He also ordered the killing of tax collectors in the region. With this message, he built a large fighting force and continued raiding against Abbasid authority for nearly 30 years, until his death in 828. After Hamza's death, other leaders continued the struggle. The Hamziya and related Ajarida groups remained active in eastern Persia until around the middle of the 9th century. Only with the rise of the Saffarids was their military strength finally broken and their political importance largely ended. Even then, scattered Kharijite communities survived for roughly another century in Sistan, Khorasan, and other eastern districts. Alongside them, another Kharijite current also found some support in the east. This was the Abadi branch, a more moderate form of Kharijism that would later become especially strong in eastern Arabia and among the Berbers of North Africa. In the Iranian lands, early Abadi groups appeared mainly in Khorasan during the late Umayyad and early Abbasid periods. Unlike the Ajarida, however, they remained oriented toward Iraq and seem not to have taken part in major rebellions. Their role was quieter and their presence never reached the same explosive political significance as that of the more militant Kharijite factions. All of this reveals the deeper reality of the Eastern Caliphate during the 9th century. Beneath the appearance of imperial unity, the region was alive with competing loyalties, unfinished conversions, local grievances, and older traditions that had not disappeared. Taxation, social inequality, regional power, and questions of religious authority all fed into one another. Khorasan and Transoxania were not simply distant provinces obeying commands from Baghdad. They were places where the meaning of Islam, empire, and political legitimacy was still being fought over in practical, violent, and often highly local ways. Out of those struggles would eventually emerge new dynasties, new cultural identities, and a more distinctly Eastern form of Islamic civilization. Among the many religious and political currents that challenged established authority in early Islam, Shi'ism left the deepest and most enduring mark on the religious landscape of the Persian world. Even so, Sunni orthodoxy remained dominant through the Abbasid period and long after. Shi'ism had begun as an Arab movement, originally centered on support for Ali ibn Abi Talib, the Prophet's cousin and son-in-law, and then, more broadly, for the Alid members of the Prophet's household. In its earliest form, it was still a relatively unified political cause rooted firmly in the Arab environment. That began to change in the late 7th century, especially after the uprising of al-Mukhtar in Kufa. His revolt was launched in the name of Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiyyah, a son of Ali, and it introduced an idea that would become immensely powerful in Shiite thought: the figure of the Mahdi, the divinely guided leader who would restore justice and rescue the oppressed. This message spoke strongly to the growing population of non-Arab converts, especially the Mawali, who were increasingly drawn into Shiite circles. With them came concepts shaped by Iranian, Zoroastrian, and other older traditions. These influences would leave a deep and lasting effect on the doctrinal development of Shi'ism. The movement associated with al-Mukhtar did not disappear when he was defeated and killed. It survived and came to be known broadly as the Kaysaniyya, which for a long time represented the majority of Shiite opinion. When Ibn al-Hanafiyyah died in 700, however, unity dissolved. The Kaysaniyya fragmented into multiple factions, each rallying around its own imam and developing its own theological direction. The largest of these groups recognized Abu Hashim Abd Allah, the eldest son of Ibn al-Hanafiyyah, as the next rightful leader. This branch, known as the Hashimiyya, became especially important in the Eastern Islamic lands. Its message spread into Persia, above all into Khorasan, where it found support not only among non-Arab converts, but also among sections of the Arab settler population. In this Eastern setting, Shiite teaching was no longer simply an extension of old Arab political disputes. It was becoming something broader, more flexible, and more open to influences from the Iranian world around it. After the death of Abu Hashim, the Hashimiyya itself split into several competing groups. Two of those branches would have especially important consequences in the Persian lands. One major faction accepted the leadership of Abd Allah ibn Muawiyah, a descendant of Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, the brother of Ali. After his failed revolt in Kufa in the mid-8th century, Ibn Muawiyah gathered support in western and southern Persia, where he attracted a remarkably broad following. Persian Mawali joined him, but so did Kharijites and other discontented elements. For a time, he established real authority in Istaka and ruled over Fars and neighbouring areas. His movement was not just a narrow family claim. It became a wider rallying point for those dissatisfied with Umayyad power and with the existing order more generally. In the end, however, he was defeated by the Umayyads, fled eastward, and was later killed after falling into the hands of Abu Muslim. The followers who remained loyal to Ibn Muawiyah developed doctrines that took Shiite and thought in far more radical directions. Known first as the Harbiyya, and later as the Janahiyya, they were associated with ideas that later Muslim writers described as extreme, mystical, and highly speculative. Among the teachings linked to them were the belief that souls existed before earthly life in a shadow-like state, the doctrine that souls could pass from one body to another, and the vision of history as unfolding in repeated cycles or ages. Whether these teachings were always fully systematized is not entirely clear, but their importance is undeniable. They helped shape the worldview of several later Shiite extremist groups and also influenced broader opposition circles in the Iranian lands. Some of these ideas seem to have crossed into the teachings of movements usually grouped under the Khurramiyya. This overlap was probably not accidental. In Western Iran, supporters of Ibn Muawiyah may well have drawn part of their strength from communities that still preserved neo-Mazdakite tendencies. Those circles would later form an important foundation for several anti-establishment movements, hostile to both Arab power and Orthodox Islam. At the same time, another and even more consequential branch of the Hashimiyya moved in a different direction. This group accepted Muhammad ibn Ali, a descendant of the Prophet's uncle al-Abbas, as the rightful successor after Abu Hashim. According to their claim, Abu Hashim had personally passed the imamate to him before his death. Whether this story was historical or politically constructed mattered less than its effect. Through it, the Abbasids inherited not only a claim to sacred leadership, but also the organizational network and revolutionary energy of the Hashimiyya. What had once been a Shiite movement now became the main instrument of Abbasid propaganda and, ultimately, of the revolution that brought down the Umayyads. In this sense, the Abbasid cause grew directly out of earlier Shiite currents, even though the dynasty that emerged would later disappoint many of those who had hoped for a more openly Alid future. The influence of this Abbasid-linked Hashimiyya did not stop with the fall of the Umayyads. Its ideas also contributed to the wider religious mixing that characterized many opposition movements in the Iranian world. The syncretic doctrines that appeared among Karami groups were shaped in part by these earlier Shiite currents, especially where expectations of a hidden or divinely guided leader blended with older Iranian religious patterns. This process became even more intense after the killing of Abu Muslim. His death sent shockwaves across Transoxania, Khorasan, and other parts of the Iranian lands. For many people in the East, Abu Muslim had become far more than a military commander or political organizer. He had become a symbol of justice, revenge, and Eastern dignity. Once he was murdered, a long series of uprisings broke out, many of them tied to Karami circles, or to groups deeply influenced by the same religious atmosphere. In this way, the legacy of early Shiite divisions, Abbasid revolutionary propaganda, and older Iranian beliefs all came together in the unrest that followed. What emerged from all this was not a simple religious movement with a single doctrine or leadership line, but a constantly shifting field of loyalties, expectations, and sacred claims. In the Persian lands, Shi'ism did not become dominant in a formal political sense during the Abbasid age, but it shaped the emotional and ideological world of opposition more than any other movement. It offered a language of injustice, rightful leadership, sacred family, hidden truth, and future redemption. These ideas could be adapted by many groups, from relatively moderate supporters of the Prophet's family to radical sectarians who believed in reincarnation, hidden imams, or divine presence in living men. That flexibility was one of Shi'ism's greatest strengths. It allowed the movement to survive defeat, absorb new influences, and continue evolving in the Iranian East, where political frustration and religious imagination repeatedly fed one another. Among the many opposition currents that emerged in early Islam, Shi'ism ultimately left the deepest and most enduring mark on the religious landscape of the Persian world, even though Sunni orthodoxy remained the dominant public order for centuries. Shi'ism began as a political cause within the Arab community, centered on the claim that leadership of the Muslim world rightfully belonged to Ali ibn Abi Talib, and then to the Prophet's family through the Alids. In its earliest stage, it was still an Arab movement in language, memory, and identity. That began to change in the late 7th century, especially after the revolt of al-Mukhtar in Kufa. He raised support in the name of Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiyyah, one of Ali's sons, and introduced a powerful idea that would shape later Shiite imagination: the coming of a divinely guided saviour who would restore justice and rescue the oppressed. This message had great appeal among the Mawali, the non-Arab converts who had entered Islam without gaining full equality. As more of them moved into Shiite circles, they brought with them concepts shaped by older Iranian and non-Islamic traditions. Those influences would remain visible in the later development of Shiite doctrine. The movement linked to al-Mukhtar did not disappear after his defeat. It survived and gradually became known as the Kaysaniyya, which for a time represented the largest body of Shiite opinion. When Ibn al-Hanafiyyah died in 700, that broad movement fractured. Different groups formed around different leaders, and each developed its own understanding of the imamate. The largest branch recognized Abu Hashim Abd Allah, the eldest son of Ibn al-Hanafiyyah, as the rightful successor. This community, known as the Hashimiyyah, became especially important in the Eastern Islamic world. Its teachings spread into Persia and found supporters in Khorasan among both non-Arab converts and sections of the Arab settlers. In that Eastern environment, Shi'ism was no longer just a continuation of old Arab political disputes. It was being reshaped by new social realities, new followers, and new expectations. After Abu Hashim's death, the Hashimiyyah also broke apart. Two of its later branches had especially important consequences in the Persian lands. One of them recognized Abd Allah ibn Muawiyah, a descendant of Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, as the new Imam. After his failed rising in Kufa during the final Umayyad decades, Ibn Muawiyah found broad support in western and southern Persia. He drew followers from many directions. Persian Mawali joined him, but so did Kharijites and other opponents of the regime. For a short period, he established real authority in Istakhr and ruled over Fars and neighbouring territories. His movement became a gathering point for wider dissatisfaction, not simply a narrow dynastic cause. Yet his success did not last. He was defeated by the Umayyads, fled eastward, and eventually died in captivity after falling into the hands of Abu Muslim. The circles that remained attached to Ibn Muawiyah developed beliefs that later writers described as highly radical and mystical. These followers, known first as the Harbiyya and later as the Janahiyya, were associated with doctrines that carried Shiite thought into a more speculative and esoteric direction. They were linked with teachings about the pre-existence of souls, the passing of the soul from one body to another, and the idea that history unfolds in repeated cycles or vast eras. However clearly or unclearly these ideas were formulated, their impact was real. They influenced other extremist Shiite groups, and also touched broader dissident circles in the Iranian world. Some of the same themes later appeared among movements often grouped under the Khurramiyya. That overlap was probably not accidental. In Western Iran, supporters of Ibn Muawiyah may well have drawn strength from communities in which neo-Mazdakite ideas still survived. Those circles would later become an important social base for anti-establishment movements, hostile to both Arab rule and the rigid form of Islam associated with imperial authority. At the same time, another branch of the Hashimiyyah moved in a direction with even greater historical consequences. This group accepted Muhammad ibn Ali, a descendant of al-Abbas, the Prophet's uncle, as the new Imam after Abu Hashim. According to its claim, Abu Hashim had personally transferred his rights to him before his death. Whether or not this story was historically true mattered less than what it accomplished politically. Through that claim, the Abbasids inherited not only a sacred line of legitimacy, but also the organizational network and revolutionary energy of the Hashimiyya, a movement that had grown from Shiite opposition, now became the main vehicle of Abbasid propaganda and the instrument that would help destroy the Umayyad state. In this way, the Abbasid revolution emerged directly out of earlier Shiite currents, even though the dynasty it produced would soon disappoint many who had hoped for a different future. The Abbasids did not take long to distance themselves from the forces that had helped lift them to power. Once they established their own caliphate, they abandoned earlier ties to radical Shiite and extremist traditions and gradually presented themselves as defenders of Sunni orthodoxy. They turned against Alid claims, persecuted Shiite circles, and eliminated many of the activists and commanders whose work had made Abbasid victory possible. None of these figures was more important than Abu Muslim al-Khurasani, the architect of the Eastern Revolution and the creator of the Khurasanian army. When he was murdered on the order of the Caliph al-Mansur, the shock was immense. His death became a major turning point in the history of revolt across the Persian lands. It gave a powerful new impulse to a wide range of syncretic movements that combined Shiite expectation, Iranian religious memory, and anti-Arab feeling. Several shadowy sectarian groups had already appeared in Khorasan during the last decades of Umayyad rule, in the same environment that produced the early Abbasid underground movement. One of the most obscure was associated with a propagandist named Ammar ibn Yazid, better known as Khidash. He had been sent east to organize Abbasid missionary activity in places such as Nishapur and Merv. But Khidash began to preach doctrines that were judged extreme even by the Abbasid leadership. He was eventually denounced, arrested, and executed. Even so, he left behind followers known as the Khidashiyya. They claim that true authority had passed to him after the Abbasids rejected him, and some of them refused to believe he had really died. Later, writers accuse him of teaching doctrines close to those of the Khurramiyya, and of allowing sexual disorder. The picture is unclear, but it is possible that at least part of his support came from neo-Mazdakite circles in Khorasan. Another movement of the same broad period gathered around a figure named Bihafarid, a native of the Zuzan region who came from a Zoroastrian background. He seems to have presented himself as a prophetic reformer. In the district of Khwaf, south of Nishapur, he denounced many practices of the established Zoroastrian clergy and preached a new syncretic teaching that combined a reworked form of Zoroastrianism with selected elements drawn from Islam. He is also said to have revived the use of Persian and to have written a book in that language. His message appealed strongly to the peasantry, and with their support he launched a revolt in northern Khorasan around the time of the Abbasid Revolution. His ideas soon alarmed the traditional Zoroastrian establishment, which complained to Abu Muslim that he was undermining both Zoroastrianism and Islam. Abu Muslim responded by having him captured in the mountains of Badghis and brought to Nishapur, where he and many of his followers were executed. Yet the movement did not vanish entirely. Followers who believed he would return continued to survive for centuries afterward. Still, the single most influential figure for these sectarian currents was Abu Muslim himself. The Abbasids, once secure in power, disowned their earlier ties to the revolutionary and Shiite world out of which they had risen. Their betrayal of Abu Muslim gave extraordinary force to a range of movements that can be described as Kurami in character. Much about these groups remains obscure, but later, scholarship has broadly confirmed that the Khurramiyya of the early Islamic age were closely related to the remnants of the old Mazdakite tradition. These were communities that had survived the destruction of Mazdak's reform movement in late Sasanian Iran and had carried fragments of its social and religious outlook into the Islamic centuries. By the Abbasid period, many such groups still existed in Central Asia and across the Iranian world, especially in remote countryside and mountain districts of Khorasan, Tabaristan, and Azerbaijan. Most were drawn from peasants and lower social layers, and many combined strong anti-Arab sentiment with a sense of Iranian self-assertion. This made them fertile ground for popular protest. They were especially receptive to syncretic teachings, and in the Islamic period they absorbed ideas from radical Shiite circles, as well as from older Iranian dualist traditions. That fusion gave the Khurramiyya its distinctive mixed character. The grievances driving these movements were not only religious, they were also social and economic. Many of these sectarians deeply resented the tax system, especially the way land taxes were assessed and collected. They also opposed the Dekhans, the local landowning class, who had adapted relatively easily to the new Islamic order and often became partners of the state. These landowners had accepted the new hierarchy and in many cases benefited from it, while peasants and smallholders carried much of the burden. That class tension fed directly into the appeal of anti-regime sectarian movements. Among the Khurrami and Neo-Mazdakite circles of the Iranian East, no figure commanded greater loyalty than Abu Muslim. He acquired followers who came to be known as the Abu Muslimiyya, or simply the Muslimiyya. Over time they divided into several branches, but all centered on the extraordinary place he came to hold in the Eastern imagination. Some viewed him as an imam, some as a prophet, and some even as a vessel of divine spirit. His popularity among Neo-Mazdakite communities seems to have grown during his own lifetime, and later, writers often identify the Khurramiyya directly with the Abu Muslimiyya. For many in the East, Abu Muslim became the symbol of Iranian dignity, standing against Arab domination. After his murder, that symbol ignited revolt. Khorasan was the first major region to explode in his name. Several uprisings there took shape around the idea of avenging him. Some followers denied that he had died at all and waited for his return to bring justice to the world. Others accepted his death but believed that the imamate had passed to his daughter Fatima. Later, some recognized Fatima's son, Mutahhar, as the new imam and Mahdi. The first major rising after Abu Muslim's death was led by the Zoroastrian Sunbad, once associated with him. From Nishapur he marched westward toward Rai, and his support grew rapidly along the way. He found sympathy in nearby regions and in the highlands south of the Caspian. Though the rebellion was crushed after only a short time, it established a lasting pattern. Later tradition remembered Sunbad's movement as a coalition of Mazdakites, Zoroastrians, and Shiites. Hostile sources claim he intended to attack the holiest symbols of Islam. But what emerges more clearly is a revolt driven by religious blending, anti-Arab anger, and broad rural support. It was a model for many later Khurrami movements. From Khorasan, these sectarian activities spread into Trans-Oxania. One of the first leaders there was Ishaq the Turk, who may once have served as one of Abu Muslim's propagandists among the Turks of Central Asia. His movement, like that of Sunbad, combined devotion to Abu Muslim with Khurrami themes. He predicted the return not only of Abu Muslim but also of Zoroaster, using a language of syncretic hope to unite otherwise separate anti-Abbasid groups. Later, the movement took on a more militant form under another leader named Barazbanda. Around the middle of the 8th century, another uprising with unclear but strongly sectarian features appeared on the eastern edge of Khorasan. It was led by a figure called Ustadsis, who may also have claimed prophetic status. His revolt began in the mountain district of Badghis and drew support mainly from villagers. Some followers of Bihafari joined him, and the rebellion quickly spread into Herat and Sistan, receiving reinforcement from Kharijite fighters in Sistan as well. The uprising was eventually crushed by an experienced Abbasid general, who killed vast numbers of the rebels. Ustadsis himself was captured in the mountains and sent to Baghdad, where he was executed. The most famous of all these eastern Kurami rebellions was led by al-Mukanna, the Veiled One, whose followers became widely known as the Wearers of White. His doctrines, as reported by later Muslim authors, were presented as openly hostile to Islam, though the accounts come from enemies and must be handled with caution. Some writers even claimed that he urged a return to the laws of Mazdak. His rebellion in Transoxania was eventually suppressed, but the movement did not vanish. Communities continued to wait for his return long after his death, and the memory of his cause endured for centuries. Kurami activity was not limited to Khorasan and Transoxania. In Gurgan, a neo-Mazdakite group known as the Wearers of Red Rose in revolt, while claiming that Abu Muslim was still alive. Led by a man presented as his grandson, they advanced as far as Rai before being defeated. Later, during the reign of Harun al-Rashid, Kurami groups also rebelled in Isfahan and other regions of central Persia. The movement reached its greatest scale under Babak al-Khurami, whose long rebellion in Azerbaijan became one of the most serious challenges the Abbasid Caliphate ever faced. Babak inherited leadership of the Kuramiya there and established himself in the mountainous district of Bad, using it as a fortress base. From there, he organised a formidable fighting force drawn mainly from the countryside and launched his revolt in the early 9th century. The rebellion lasted for more than 20 years and spread from Azerbaijan into western and central Iran. Repeated Abbasid expeditions failed to crush him. Only when the Caliph appointed Afshin to deal with the crisis did the state finally gain the upper hand. Babak's stronghold was captured, and he himself was soon taken and sent to Samarra, where he was executed with brutal ceremony. Very little can be known with certainty about his exact teachings, but hostile sources portray him as both anti-Arab and anti-Islamic. Some even claim that he too was expected to restore the religion of Mazdak. Whatever the truth of those accusations, groups loyal to his memory survived long after his death, continuing to await his return. Soon after Babak's defeat, another dangerous rising appeared in Tabaristan under Mazyar, a local ruler who had recently embraced Islam. Muslim sources accuse him of returning to Zoroastrianism and conspiring with Babak against Islam, and some later writers classed his followers among the Khuramiya. Yet his rebellion seems to have emerged above all from financial conflict with the Tahirid governor of the East. Even so, he increasingly relied on support from local Zoroastrian and Neo-Mazdakite peasants. He too was defeated and later executed. Not long afterward, Afshin himself was accused of treachery and anti-Islamic sympathies, and was put to death. Later, Muslim tradition tried to tie Babak, Mazyar, and Afshin together as part of a vast anti-Arab conspiracy. But that picture is too simple. Their causes were connected more by circumstance, shared enemies, and overlapping support than by any single grand design. Even after the great Kurami rebellions had failed, smaller Kurami communities survived in different parts of Iran, especially in Azerbaijan, Tabaristan, and Khorasan. Some may later have joined the revolutionary movement of the Ismailis, particularly in the east. Even so, Ismailism should not be seen as a direct continuation of the Khuramiya. Both opposed Abbasid authority, but the Ismailis were a Shiite Muslim movement and could not embrace the openly anti-Islamic or anti-Arab teachings attributed to many Kurami groups. Shi'ism itself provided another and more durable form of opposition to the Caliphate. By around 760, the old radical Kaysani groups had largely disappeared or been absorbed into the Imami branch of Shi'ism, which had previously been overshadowed. The Imamis traced the line of rightful leadership through Hussein and his descendants, and gained clearer shape under the guidance of Ja'far al-Sadiq. Under him, Imami Shi'ism became a more distinct and organized community, but one marked by political quietism rather than open revolt. Ja'far taught that the infallible Imam did not need to rise in arms against unjust rulers, even though the caliphate belonged to him by divine right. He also encouraged the careful concealment of belief when necessary. This withdrawal from direct rebellion became the defining feature of the Imami tradition, which would later be known as Twelver Shi'ism. From Kufa, this branch of Shi'ism spread into central Persia, especially to Qum, where an Arab clan originally from Kufa had settled during the late Umayyad period. By the late 8th century, their descendants had become devoted Imami Shiites, and Qum grew into the main centre of Imami traditional learning in Persia. Its influence later spread to other cities, especially Rai. In Khorasan, Imami Shi'ism also gained ground during the 9th century. A community already existed in Tus when Ali al-Rida, the 8th Imam, died there after being named heir by al-Ma'mun. Nishapur too became an important centre of Imami thought through the work of leading scholars. By the late 9th and early 10th centuries, Imami ideas had also reached Transoxania, where they developed a local presence of their own. The first Iranian dynasty to adopt Imami Shi'ism openly would only do so much later, and the full triumph of Twelver Shi'ism in Iran belonged to a far later age. For most of the Abbasid and post-Abbasid centuries, Imami communities remained minorities scattered across the Iranian world and Central Asia. Even so, their intellectual and religious presence steadily grew. Another important branch, Zaydi Shi'ism, also appeared in the Iranian world during the early Abbasid era, though its long-term influence was more limited. It grew out of the revolt of Zayd ibn Ali, who rose against the Umayyads in Kufa. His followers kept the activist political spirit of the early Shiite movement while remaining relatively moderate in doctrine. Unlike the Imamis, the Zaydis expected the rightful Imam to rise in arms against unjust rule. Early attempts to establish Zaydi influence in the east, including the revolt of Zayd's son Yahya in Khorasan, did not produce lasting results. But later, as Alid families fled Abbasid persecution, Zaydi influence spread into the Caspian region. There, among the still only partly Islamized populations of Tabaristan and Daylam, Zaydi rule eventually took root. Supported by local aspirations for autonomy, Alid leaders established states in the Caspian provinces and turned the region into the main Iranian center of Zaydi Shi'ism. Yet even there, Zaydism would eventually yield to Twelver Shi'ism. Ismailism had a wider and more far-reaching impact than Zaydism. It emerged from a succession dispute after Ja'far al-Sadiq and developed into a secret revolutionary movement dedicated to overthrowing the Abbasids. Its leaders organized an underground missionary network that spread across both Arab and Iranian lands. By the late 9th century, Ismaili propagandists had become active in western Iran, especially around Rai, and then in Fars, and eventually in Khorasan. In the east, some of the most important Ismaili leaders established themselves in cities such as Nishapur, Merv al-Rud, and Bukhara. There, the movement even reached elite circles and briefly touched the inner world of the Samanid court. One of its leading thinkers in Transoxania helped introduce philosophical ideas that would have a lasting impact on Ismaili intellectual life. At first, Ismaili preaching in Iran focused on the countryside, but unlike the older Qurami movements, it failed to win mass peasant support. Recognizing this, the movement changed strategy. In Khorasan and Transoxania especially, the missionaries began turning toward the elite and the ruling classes. This approach gained some temporary successes. In central Iran and the Caspian lands, several rulers were influenced by the movement. In Central Asia, the strategy reached its high point when the Samanid ruler, Nasser II, and his vizier were converted by the efforts of an Ismaili missionary. That success, however, alarmed the Sunni scholars and the Turkish military establishment of the Samanid state. They moved quickly, removed Nasser from power, and carried out executions and massacres against Ismaili circles. Meanwhile, the Ismaili movement itself suffered a major split. One side accepted the claims of the future Fatimid line, while the other rejected them and remained attached to the older expectation of a hidden Mahdi. In the Iranian lands, both tendencies existed, though the dissident current remained especially strong for a long time in Khorasan and Transoxania. By the late 11th century, however, these older communities had either disintegrated or been absorbed into later forms of Ismailism. In the end, the Persian Ismailis would become the strongest supporters of the Nizari branch. Under Hassani Sabah, they were organized into a disciplined revolutionary force based in mountain fortresses across Iran, especially in Dailaman and Kuhistan. Their strategy, based on secure and inaccessible strongholds, echoed the methods once used by several of the earlier Kurami movements. Opposed now not only to Abbasid claims, but also to the rule of the Seljuk Turks, the Nizaris fought to establish their own authority in parts of Iran, and maintained that position for generations. Like the Abbasids themselves, however, they would eventually be broken by the Mongol invasions, losing their political power in the 13th century. While many religious and political movements rose across the Eastern Islamic world during the 8th and 9th centuries, only one had truly reshaped power on an imperial scale: the Abbasid revolution itself. Other uprisings, no matter how intense or widespread, failed to break the authority of the caliphate in any lasting way. Rebellions erupted again and again across Khorasan, Transoxania, and the wider Iranian lands, yet none succeeded in carving out a durable independent state. For decades, the territorial structure of the Abbasid world remained intact. Beneath that surface, however, deep transformations were already unfolding. Gradually, both the political center in Iraq and the distant provinces began to shift, and the forces that would eventually fragment the caliphate were quietly gathering strength. For nearly 70 years after the Abbasids came to power, the Iranian lands were governed by officials appointed from the imperial center. These governors acted in the name of the caliph, reinforced his authority in ritual and administration, and ensured that taxes continued to flow toward Baghdad. Among them, one family stood out: the Tahirids. Beginning in the early 9th century, several generations of this family governed the eastern provinces from Khorasan. Their authority was strong, their influence wide, and their tenure long-lasting. Yet they did not represent independence. They remained loyal to the caliphate, upheld its institutions, and operated fully within its framework. Their culture and outlook reflected the broader Arabo-Islamic world of the time, even though they were of Iranian origin. Still, their presence hinted at something new. They tolerated the use of Persian in their courts and maintained connections to older Iranian traditions. In doing so, they quietly contributed to a cultural revival that would become far more visible in the generations that followed. By the middle of the 9th century, the balance of power had begun to change. The central authority of the caliphate weakened, especially as military elites gained influence in Baghdad. The rise of Turkish slave soldiers and their commanders created instability at the heart of the empire. Control over distant provinces grew fragile. In this environment, new forces emerged along the edges of the Abbasid world. Some were local uprisings, others were regional movements, but a few developed into something far more significant. Among them, the Saffarids stood out as the first to establish a truly independent power in the eastern Iranian lands. Their founder, Yaqub ibn Layth, came from humble origins. Unlike many rulers before him, he was not shaped by aristocratic lineage or scholarly training. He rose through the ranks of local warrior bands in Sistan, gaining influence through strength, leadership, and ambition. In time, he seized control of the region and was proclaimed its ruler. From there, he moved outward, securing his position at home before launching campaigns across the surrounding lands. His armies marched into what is now Afghanistan, fought against rival groups, and gradually extended their reach into territories still claimed by the Abbasid state. When he entered Nishapur, the long-standing Tahirid authority in Khorasan came to an end. Soon after, he took control of Fars and pushed westward, coming dangerously close to Baghdad itself. His advance signals something entirely new: a regional power no longer content to act in the name of the Caliph, but willing to challenge him directly. Yaqub did not live to see the full outcome of his campaigns, but his achievements reshaped the political map of the East. Under his successor, the Safarid state reached its greatest extent, controlling large portions of eastern Iran and beyond. Yet this expansion did not last. Defeat in Transoxania marked the beginning of decline, and within a short time their power contracted back towards Sistan. Even so, the precedent had been set. The unity of the Abbasid world had been broken, and new dynasties would follow. At the same time, another transformation was taking place, quieter but equally significant. A cultural revival began to emerge among the Iranian peoples, expressed above all through language. For generations, Arabic had dominated administration, scholarship, and literature. Now, Persian began to return as a language of prestige and creativity. Under the Safarids, poets were encouraged to compose in Persian once again. This was more than a literary shift. It reflected a renewed awareness of identity among the Islamized populations of Iran, who had never fully lost connection with their past. The culture that developed in this period was not a rejection of Islam, but a fusion of Islamic and Iranian elements, creating something distinct and lasting. As political authority fragmented, the Abbasid caliphs remained important, but in a different way. Their direct control weakened, yet their symbolic role endured. They were still recognized as spiritual leaders, even in lands where their political power had faded. In western Iran and Iraq, new dynasties rose and struggled for dominance. In the east, Turkish powers began to assert themselves. Dynasties such as the Ghaznavids and the Karakhanids expanded their influence, and eventually the Seljuks emerged as the dominant force. When the Seljuks entered Baghdad in the mid-11th century, they did so under the banner of restoring order and defending Sunni Islam. In reality, they became the new masters of the political landscape, while the Caliph remained as a legitimizing figure. This shift marked the beginning of a new era. Turkish rulers now controlled much of the Iranian world, yet they were deeply influenced by the culture they governed. Persian language and traditions continued to flourish, even under foreign rule. Scholars, poets, and administrators helped shape a shared civilization that blended multiple elements into a unified whole. The cultural revival that had begun earlier could no longer be reversed. During these same centuries, far to the northeast, another story was unfolding across the vast steppes of Central Asia. Here, the Oghuz Turks were forming a new political and social order. Their origins lay in regions further east, near the mountains and lakes of Inner Asia. Over time, pressures from rival tribes and shifting alliances forced them to move westward. Their migrations were not peaceful journeys, but long sequences of conflict, negotiation, and adaptation. They crossed rivers, occupied new lands, and gradually established themselves across the steppe zones, stretching from the Syr Darya to the northern Caspian. Their movement reshaped the balance of power across a wide region. They clashed with other nomadic confederations, especially the Pechenegs, in prolonged and often brutal struggles. These conflicts were not isolated battles, but extended campaigns that determined control over pasture lands, trade routes, and strategic territories. In the end, the Oghuz emerged victorious, pushing their rivals aside and consolidating their position. Their power expanded westward, bringing them into contact with the frontiers of Europe and the Byzantine world. As they settled into their new domains, the Oghuz formed a structured political system. At its head stood a supreme ruler, supported by a network of tribal leaders, military commanders, and councils. Authority was shared, negotiated, and sometimes contested. Leadership depended not only on inheritance, but also on strength, reputation, and the support of key groups. Society was organized along tribal lines, with clear hierarchies, but also a strong sense of collective identity. Most members of this society were nomadic warriors, living by herding, raiding, and trade. Yet their world was not isolated. They maintained connections with neighboring settled regions, exchanging goods, livestock, and resources. Their presence influenced the wider history of Eurasia. They formed alliances when it suited them and launched campaigns when necessary. In some cases, they cooperated with distant powers to destroy common enemies. In others, they acted independently, reshaping the political landscape through force. Their role in the destruction of older steppe empires marked a turning point, opening new possibilities for expansion and settlement. Despite their strength, the Oghuz world was not stable. Internal tensions grew over time. As rulers attempted to impose more regular systems of taxation and control, resistance emerged among the tribes. Discontent spread, and rival leaders challenged central authority. Among these rising groups were the ancestors of the Seljuks, who began as part of the wider Oghuz world, but eventually broke away. Their movement westward would carry them into the heart of the Islamic world, where they would establish one of the most powerful empires of the medieval period. Back in the steppe, the old Oghuz political structure began to weaken. External pressures added to internal divisions. New groups entered the region, competing for the same lands and resources. Over time, the once dominant confederation fragmented. By the middle of the 11th century, its unity had collapsed under the combined weight of internal rebellion and external invasion. The Kipchaks, who eventually destroyed the power of the Syr Darya Yabgus, did not simply appear out of nowhere. They were connected to the wider Kimek world, but they were not identical with it. Their shared roots stretched far back into an older past, and by the 8th or early 9th century, the Kipchaks had become one important branch within the Kimek tribal federation. That federation was made up of several major tribes, including the Imur, Imak, Tatar, Bayundur, Kipchak, Nilkar, and Ajlad. These groups had originally come from the eastern steppe world of Inner Asia before moving westward into the lands of present-day Kazakhstan. Much of that migration seems to have accelerated after the destruction of the Uyghur Empire in Mongolia in 840, when the balance of power across the steppe was violently shaken. Some of these tribes, especially the Imur and the Bayundur, became closely tied to the Kimek political structure, while others were gradually absorbed into neighbouring peoples, such as the Oghuz. At first, the main Kimek settlement zone lay across the Irtish steppe. Before that, they had lived among other Turkic peoples near the southern Altai and the Tarbagatai, with the Yenisei Kyrgyz farther to the east. Sometime in the later 8th or early 9th century, Kimek clans and several related tribes shifted into northeastern Semirechye and the foothills of the Dzungarian range. At roughly the same time, Kipchak groups began moving southward and westward from the Irtysh. Between the 9th and 11th centuries, the Kimeks remained most densely concentrated around the middle Irtysh basin and northeastern Semirechye, while many Kipchaks and related Kimek elements spread across central Kazakhstan, the northern Balkhash region, the Aral zone, and the southern Urals. Their range reached the middle Syr-Darya, around places like Sauran and Turkestan, while their eastern edge touched the Tarbagatay and the Dzungarian Alatau. Earlier, up to the middle of the 7th century, the Kimeks had been part of the Western Turkic Khaganate. After that state collapsed, they slowly developed into an independent tribal union. The downfall of the Uyghur power later gave fresh momentum to this process. The title of their ruler rose in importance as well. A leader who had once held a relatively modest rank now began to bear the title of Khagan. Medieval Muslim geographers described this ruler as a figure of considerable authority, appointing subordinate tribal chiefs who were treated almost like kings. Power in the ruling line passed hereditarily, and the Kimek court appears to have developed a recognizable administrative structure. The Khagan and his nobles lived in a capital in the Irtysh region, surrounded by attendants, officials, and court administrators. Even the visual language of power had become more elaborate. The ruling elite wore costly garments of bright silk, signaling wealth and prestige in a world often imagined as purely nomadic and rough. The Kimek state that emerged in the late 9th and early 10th centuries was not a tightly centralized empire. It was divided into a number of regional domains, each controlled by hereditary rulers, who received their lands in exchange for military service. These subordinate lords were expected to provide cavalry and infantry for campaigns or emergency defense. They were subject to the Khagan, but the most powerful among them had wide autonomy and ruled their own semi-independent territories. Each maintained fortified residences, often in elevated positions, where troops, food, and treasure were kept. This structure gave the Confederation flexibility and reach, but it also planted the seeds of future weakness. As these domains became more entrenched, central authority became harder to maintain. Like other major steppe peoples, the Kimeks lived by mobility, but that did not mean they followed a simple pattern. Some groups wintered between the Ural and Emba rivers and moved toward the Irtysh in summer, especially when harsh weather made life difficult in the east. Oghuz groups also sometimes shared or borrowed pasture zones in Kimek territory. Their economy rested above all on animal husbandry. Like the Kipchaks and the Oghuz, the Kimeks raised horses, sheep, goats, cattle, and camels. Sheep were especially important, and in the open steppe, wild animal fat often replaced vegetable oil for light and daily household use. Horses were central not only to war and transport, but also to social life and prestige. The steppe horse was valued for endurance and adaptability, and large herds were one of the main sources of wealth. Horse meat was widely consumed, and fermented mare's milk remained one of the defining drinks of nomadic life. Cattle also played a role, especially among more settled or semi-settled groups, though oxen were also practical draft animals. They pulled carts that carried the felt-covered tents of mobile households. Hunting remained another important activity. Like the Oghuz and Kipchaks, the Kimeks hunted foxes, martens, beavers, sable, ermine, and even large predators such as snow leopards and tigers in the broader steppe and forest margins. Pelts and hides from both wild and domestic animals were sold or exchanged in markets close to settled agricultural lands in the south. Although nomadism remained dominant, some Kimek groups also engaged in agriculture. These were usually semi-settled communities who had turned to farming either out of necessity or because conditions had pushed them toward a more mixed way of life. Livestock disease, cattle raids or severe winters could force pastoralists to settle more firmly on the land. These groups mainly grew millet, though wheat, barley, and even rice are also mentioned in connection with settled Turkic populations of the steppe zone. Small vegetable gardens and even vineyards existed in some places, although agriculture remained limited and could hardly satisfy all their needs. Craft production formed another layer of Chimek life. Animal skins were used for shoes, containers, quivers, bow cases, and horse gear. Women worked wool into felt, made clothing, and produced large felt sheets and flat rugs. Fur garments were also common. Weapon production was especially important. Bows, arrows, quivers, and spears were essential to steppe, warfare, and everyday survival. Ironworking was known, and the Chimeks, like the Oghuz, were remembered as capable metalworkers who also produced fine ornaments in gold and silver. Their rulers wore crowns of gold and garments embroidered with golden thread, showing that steppe elites could display splendor no less striking than that of settled courts. In the 9th and 10th centuries, the Chimek state ranked among the most powerful nomadic formations in Central Asia. Yet its internal structure gradually undermined it. The growth of semi-independent regional rulers weakened the authority of the Khagans. In time, the federation could no longer resist pressure from rival nomadic powers. Out of this shifting landscape, the Kipchaks rose to dominance. The early history of the Kipchaks remains difficult to reconstruct in full, but it is one of the most important turning points in the history of the Eurasian steppe. Some scholars have connected these changes to events much farther east, especially the expansionist policies of the Liao Empire in northern China. According to this view, pressure from the east set off a long chain reaction of migration across Inner Asia. One people displaced another, which then moved into the lands of a third, producing a wave of motion that rippled from eastern Central Asia all the way to the western steppe. In this interpretation, movements involving groups such as the Kun and the Sari eventually affected the Chimek and Kipchak world. The result was that the Kipchaks pressed harder against the neighbouring Oghuz in the Aral, northern Caspian, and lower Volga regions, finally pushing into the lower Syr-Darya basin and taking over the lands between the Volga and the Ural. The name Kipchak first appears in sources from the 7th century, when they were living near the upper Irtish and the nearby steppe of eastern Kazakhstan and the southern Altai. By the 10th century, Kipchak groups were already present in central Kazakhstan and north of the Aral Sea, reaching toward western Siberia in the east. At first, they were subordinate to the Chimek Khagans, but over time they formed a more independent ethno-political union of their own. By the middle of the 11th century, the balance of power in western Central Asia, the Kazakh steppe, and the lower Volga had clearly shifted in their favour. After defeating the Oghuz and taking over their lands, the Kipchaks became the dominant force across much of the western steppe. Their movement also pressed southward toward Khwarezm and the lower Oxus. Other groups were drawn into this changing frontier. Some sources mention that the Kipchaks, together with related peoples such as the Yigrak and the Kujat, settled in the steppe near Khwarezm. The Yigrak may have been Oghuz elements who gradually merged with the Kipchaks, while the origins of the Kujat remain uncertain, though they too may have been Eastern Turkic groups, later absorbed into the wider federation. In the struggles of Khwarezm for greater independence from larger imperial powers, these steppe peoples were recruited into military service. Kipchak chiefs in particular began to acquire real influence within the armies of the Khwarezm Shahs. By the end of the 11th century, the Kipchaks occupied the Aral and northern Caspian zones, alternately with the Oghuz groups they had subdued. Their southeastern frontier approached the Taraz region, while to the east their camps stretched back toward the Irtish and the western Altai. The collapse of both the Oghuz and Chimek states in the middle of the 11th century greatly accelerated the consolidation of the Kipchak Federation. What had once been scattered and loosely connected groups across a vast area now became a more coherent power. From the Irtysh to the Volga and far beyond, the name Kipchak came to define a new political and ethnic reality. Their expansion westward transformed the map of Eurasia. The Kipchaks surged into the south Russian and Black Sea steppes, and eastern sources came to describe this immense zone as the Kipchak steppe. In the Russian world, it became known as the land of the Polovtsians. This western movement was accompanied by large-scale assimilation. The Kipchak Federation absorbed Oghuz groups, Kimek elements, and many other Turkic peoples. This process was made easier by similarities in language, economy, and social structure. They also incorporated Bayundur groups of Oghuz or Kimek origin, as well as peoples such as the Baya-Ut, the Kangli, and the Urani. Some of these groups later played important roles in the armies and courts of neighbouring states. Other peoples of the wider steppe also lived within this vast Kipchak world, including ancient Bashkir elements and populations described in some sources as Uyghurs. Over time, many of these peoples were drawn into a new, broader Kipchak identity. This federation was not governed through a single centralised state. The dashed I Kipchak contained many major confederations and territorial groupings. Some were based around the Dnieper, Dniester, Ural, and Lower Volga. Others lay farther east, around the Aral Sea, the northern Caspian, the lower and middle Syr-Darya, and eastern Kazakhstan. Each major grouping had its own Khan, its own army, and its own pasture lands. These migration zones were clearly defined, and movement followed established custom, with the approval of tribal elders and ruling families. Tribal units were led by begs, while larger groupings were ruled by hereditary khans, supported by retainers, servants, and slaves. The appearance of the Kipchaks dramatically altered the political balance across the steppes, Central Asia, and Eastern Europe. Their southward advance directly affected settled regions such as Khwarezm, Gurgan, and Khorasan. By the 1040s, Khwarezm had fallen under Seljuk control, and the defeat of the last major Oghuz Yabgu helped break the remaining strength of the old Oghuz political order. The Kipchaks quickly exploited that collapse. They took over the Aral region and then pushed through Mangishlak and the Ustyurt Plateau into Eastern Europe. By the middle of the 11th century, they controlled enormous stretches of steppe from western and southern Kazakhstan to the lower Volga, while important rulers held power on the lower Syr-Darya with centres such as Jand. Their growing strength attracted the attention of great neighbouring powers. In the 1060s, Seljuk forces under Alp Arslan campaigned against Kipchak and Turkmen groups that had seized parts of the Karakum. Faced with the threat of a major royal army, the supreme Kipchak ruler concluded peace and acknowledged Seljuk power. Yet this did not end Kipchak influence. In the 12th and early 13th centuries, some scholars believe that a ruling lineage known as the Ilbari dominated a large part of the eastern Kipchak world. One member of this wider ruling milieu would later rise from slavery in India to become a ruler in Delhi, an extraordinary reminder of how far steppe politics could extend across the medieval world. At the same time, Kipchak leaders became deeply entangled with the Khwarezm Shahs. The expanding Khwarezmian state and the Kipchak confederations competed fiercely over the towns of the lower and middle Syr-Darya, vital centres on the trade routes connecting Central Asia with Eastern Europe. The early rulers of Khwarezm were concerned above all with defending their northern frontier against the powerful nomadic world beyond it. One ruler eventually campaigned into Mangishlak, defeating the Kipchaks and their Oghuz allies and taking Jand. Soon after, he dealt a serious blow to a major Kipchak Khan, causing turmoil among the nomadic tribes. One powerful confederation of this period seems to have been led by the Urani tribe. Sources from the late 12th and early 13th centuries mention several Urani nobles who played important parts in the political struggles around Khwarezm. Marriage alliances linked some of them directly to the Khwarezm Shahs. Yet these connections did not bring stability. Rivalries among Kipchak leaders remained intense, especially over control of Signak, one of the chief political centres of the Sir Darya steppe. The Khwarezmian rulers repeatedly tried to exploit these disputes, playing one chief against another in order to weaken the steppe confederations. This policy sometimes worked, but it also carried risks. In one campaign, the Khwarezm Shah marched against a major Kipchak rival near Signak. Yet many Kipchaks already served in his own army, and at a critical moment, they refused to fight their kinsmen. Instead, they abandoned the Shah and crossed over to the other side. He suffered defeat, though he later regained influence through local allies and eventually imposed control over Signak. Even then, however, the nomadic tribes continued to resist outside domination. In the early 13th century, rebellions broke out again in the regions around Jand and Signak. These uprisings were crushed, and many surviving Kipchaks withdrew northward into the central Kazakh steppe. The long wars with Khwarezm weakened the Kipchak world. Constant campaigning, political manipulation and internal rivalry fragmented the Dasht-e Kipchak. What had once been a vast and formidable nomadic sphere was increasingly divided, its leaders competing among themselves, while stronger enemies pressed from the south and east. When the armies of Chinggis Khan burst into central Eurasia in the early 13th century, the Kipchaks were no longer in a position to mount a united resistance. Their political cohesion had already been damaged. As a result, the Mongol conquest swept through the steppe, and the lands of the Kipchaks were absorbed into the enormous imperial system that followed. By the 10th century, most Iranian peoples across Khorasan, Transoxania, and Khwarezm were no longer using the older Middle Iranian languages as their main means of expression. Persians, Bactrians, Sogdians, Khwarezmians, and others increasingly spoke and wrote in New Persian, the form that would later become known as Farsi Dari. Older languages did not vanish overnight. Sogdian still survived in some areas, and Khwarezmian endured for centuries in its own regional setting. But the cultural direction of the age was clear. A new common language was taking shape across much of the eastern Iranian world. At the same time, an older term once used in western Iran for the Arab conquerors began to shift in meaning. In Khorasan and Transoxania, it came to refer more broadly to Muslims in general, most of whom by then were Persian-speaking. Later, still, as Turkish military and tribal elites became more visible in Central Asia, the word was increasingly used to distinguish the settled Persian-speaking population from the Turkic world around it. In time, that label developed into the better-known form that would remain standard in Central Asia for centuries. Under the Samanids in the later 9th and 10th centuries, the cities of the region entered a period of remarkable growth. Urban life expanded across Khorasan and Transoxania, and places such as Nishapur, Merv, Balkh, Bukhara, Samarkand, Khujand, Bunjikat, and Hulbuk became major centres of social, economic, and cultural activity. The history of the Samanid state began with a local landed family whose origins were tied to a figure remembered as Saman Kuda. He was associated with an estate called Saman, though later traditions place this place in different regions. What matters more is that his family entered the Islamic political world through service and patronage. He came under the influence of a governor of Khorasan and accepted Islam, and the next generation moved more deeply into the administrative and military life of the Eastern Caliphate. His descendants took part in suppressing revolts, supported the Abbasid regime, and were rewarded with governorships over rich provinces. One ruled Samarkand, another Fergana, another Chach and Usrushana, and another Herat. These appointments gave the family a strong territorial base across the eastern Iranian world. Although the Samanids initially remained beneath the wider authority of the Tahirids, they were already acting with considerable independence inside their own domains. They minted coins in their own names, raised military forces, and campaigned against neighbouring territories. Among the early members of the family, some did more than others to strengthen its position. One secured frontier zones against the Turks, while another laid the real foundations for wider expansion through his sons, who gradually brought more of Transoxania under a single family network. By the middle of the 9th century, the main provinces of the region were already concentrated in the hands of this one house. Yet the real architect of the Samanid state was Ismail ibn Ahmad. Born in the mid-9th century, he first rose to political importance in Bukhara, where he was appointed governor by his older brother after the weakening of Tahirid authority. From that point onward, Bukhara became the centre of a new political order. Tensions between the brothers eventually led to open conflict, and Ismail's victory made him the dominant figure in Transoxania. From there, he built something far more durable than a family holding. He organised a structured system of central and provincial administration, strengthened the army, secured the frontiers, encouraged commercial stability, and created favourable conditions for learning and literary life. His victories over the Safavids opened the way for the incorporation of Khorasan, Sistan, Tukharistan, and Kabulistan into the Samanid sphere, while in the Sir Darya basin he established a defended frontier stretching across key steppe approaches. At the height of Samanid power, their influence reached from the mountain zones of the southeast to the Persian Gulf. Even so, the outer provinces often remained semi-autonomous, and local dynasties were frequently left in place. Religious uniformity was also incomplete. In the upper Oxus regions, some communities still followed older faiths, long after the main lowland centres had become Muslim. After Ismail, the dynasty passed to his son Ahmad, who appears in the sources as a devout Muslim ruler. He tried to strengthen Arabic in administration and favoured officials who knew it, but that policy alienated powerful court circles and sections of the military guard. He was soon murdered, and the throne passed to the young Nasr II. Real authority in the early years of that reign belonged largely to able viziers, who restored order, calmed rebellions, and ensured the conditions for another period of prosperity. Under Nasr, the state remained strong, but later reigns saw growing strain. Court intrigue increased, rebellions became more frequent, and Turkish military guards gained greater influence. By the later 10th century, outside pressure from rising powers such as the Karakhanids and the Ghaznavids added to these internal difficulties. Eventually, the Samanid lands were divided between those rivals, and efforts to restore the dynasty failed. Still, for nearly a century, the Samanids created one of the strongest and most impressive states in the Eastern Islamic world. Their rule protected Transoxania and Khorasan from large-scale nomadic invasions and allowed agriculture, trade, crafts, scholarship, literature, and art to flourish. Contemporary observers admired them as rulers who respected learning and valued educated men. Members of the ruling family and their ministers themselves took part in intellectual life. Some wrote poetry, some produced works of geography or history, and several became known for literary talent as much as for administration. This was not accidental. The Samanid court became one of the chief environments in which an Iranian Muslim high culture matured. The state they built was supported by a clear administrative structure. At the top stood the emir, while provinces were ruled by appointed governors. Around the ruler stood the court and a series of central bureaus. One oversaw general administration, politics, and the economy. Others dealt with finance, diplomatic correspondence, military affairs, policing, intelligence, market supervision, fiscal control, judicial matters, and religious endowments. This was not a loose tribal monarchy, but a well-articulated government. Its main practical task, however, remained the collection of revenue. Taxes from peasants, craftsmen, and merchants supported both the state and the army. A very large portion of the budget went directly to maintaining soldiers and officials. In theory, the Samanids ruled as deputies of the Abbasid Caliph. Like most rulers of the Islamic world at that time, they upheld the formal ideal that all legitimate authority ultimately flowed from the Caliph and from the sacred law. In practice, they were almost independent, yet they continued to honour the symbolic framework of caliphal legitimacy. Society under them was hierarchical and conservative in structure. Older Iranian landed elites, especially the Dekhans, retained much of their local influence, particularly in more distant provinces. Landed property remained concentrated in the hands of the ruling house, major landlords, officials, and religious institutions. Some lands were taxed according to productivity, some were exempt, and others paid only a tithe. In many places, cultivation operated through sharecropping, with small plots worked by tenants, who handed over an agreed share of the harvest. Beneath this structure stood a very large peasant population, much of it poor or nearly landless. Their harsh conditions may help explain some of the outbreaks of unrest that appeared during the Samanid period. Rebellions by peasants and artisans did occur, and religious dissent sometimes blended with social discontent, especially where Ismaili or other heterodox influences were present. Over time, internal rivalries, court conspiracies, provincial tensions, and the growing strength of centrifugal forces weakened the state. Financial pressure deepened the problem. By the end of the 10th century, the Samanids could no longer resist major invasions from the north and east. Yet before that collapse, they had overseen one of the most productive periods in the history of the region. The basis of that prosperity was agriculture. Once Khorasan and Transoxania were brought together under one strong power, and once steppe incursions were held back, the conditions for economic growth improved dramatically. These lands were overwhelmingly agrarian. Farming relied on seasonal streams, springs, and above all on elaborate irrigation systems, both surface canals and underground channels. Many of these systems were older, especially in the Zarafshan and Fergana valleys. But during the 9th and 10th centuries, new canals, dams, and hydraulic works were added. In one mountain gorge, a substantial stone dam was built to create a reservoir. Elsewhere, new canals were cut from major rivers. Dry farming also existed in suitable areas, but irrigation remained the foundation of production. Across the oases of Sogdiana, Fergana, Chach, Usrushana, Kutal, Jaganian, Khorasan, Garchistan, and Sistan, peasants cultivated wheat, barley, rice, millet, legumes, oilseeds, and many other crops. Cotton became especially important in several regions, including the Zarafshan Basin, Fergana, and the Merv Oasis. Orchard cultivation was highly developed as well. Apricots, peaches, apples, pears, quinces, cherries, plums, pomegranates, figs, walnuts, and almonds all flourished in the irrigated lands. Vineyards were widespread, with some grape varieties acquiring famous reputations. Vegetable growing and melon cultivation also reached a high level. The melons of Bukhara and Merv were celebrated as among the finest anywhere. Sistan produced dates, while Balkh cultivated sugarcane. Medieval geographers spoke enthusiastically of the fertility of these lands, describing great green expanses across the oasis world. Among the most productive districts were Balkh and the lands between Herat and Merv al-Rud. Beyond the irrigated zones, the steppe and mountain margins supported extensive animal husbandry, especially sheep and horse breeding. Mining formed another major part of the economy. Across Central Asia, a wide range of minerals were extracted and processed. The evidence comes both from written testimony and from archaeology. Badakhshan, Darvaz, Rushan, and Shugnan yielded rubies, lapis lazuli, and silver. Tukharistan produced lead, sulfur, and other minerals. The upper Zarafshan Valley provided iron, gold, silver, and vitriol. Uzurushana was known for large quantities of iron, while coal was found in the Isfara region. Fergana was particularly rich, with iron, tin, silver, mercury, copper, lead, bitumen, asbestos, turquoise, sal ammoniac, and perhaps petroleum. The Ahangaran Valley became a major centre for the treatment of silver and lead ore. Salt was mined in Elak and in the Kashgar Darya basin. Khorasan too had important mineral resources: turquoise near Nishapur, marble in Baihak, fine stone near Tus, gold and iron in Garchistan, copper around Merv, and sulfur, lead, arsenic, and other useful materials in the Balkh zone. Other districts yielded gold, silver, iron, copper, and various chemical minerals. Archaeological and geological work has revealed the scale and sophistication of this industry. Some mines were enormous by the standards of the age. Both free workers and unfree labourers took part in extraction, and in at least one mining site, the iron fetters of slave labourers have been found. Mining occupied a major place in the economy, and its scale offers a revealing measure of wider economic development. This agricultural and mineral wealth fed directly into the craft economy. Textile production stood out as one of the most important branches. Certain towns became famous for specific fabrics. Settlements near Bukhara, Samarkand, and the Surkhan Darya Valley were known for fine cotton cloth exported far beyond Transoxania. Both fine and ordinary cotton fabrics were produced in large quantities in Samarkand, Dabusia, Bukhara, Nasaf, Kish, and many other towns. Woolen cloth and garments were made in numerous places, especially in towns close to the steppe, where there was strong demand from nomadic customers. Leatherworking also flourished in those zones, supplying goods suited to a pastoral market. Samarkand's paper became famous not only within Transoxania, but throughout the Middle East, gradually replacing older writing materials in major Islamic lands. Samarkand glass was also highly valued and even appreciated in China. Fergana, Usrushana, and Kujand produced armour, weapons, agricultural tools, and metalware. The processing of agricultural products was equally important. Watermills were widespread in river valleys, and in some areas, one river alone powered dozens of mills. Wind energy was also used, both for milling and for lifting water from wells. Pottery developed into a highly refined industry. Glazed ceramics with elegant decoration became common, and the rims of vessels were often inscribed with Quranic phrases, literary quotations, or brief expressions of blessing. Cheaper wares were produced in bulk for ordinary people, while fine metal and glass vessels served wealthier consumers. All of this supported a lively internal and external trade. Goods moved constantly between town and countryside, between oasis and steppe, and across long-distance caravan routes. Agrarian districts and cities exported bread, dried fruits, fabrics, weapons, and utensils to the nomads, who in return brought livestock, wool, hides, and slaves to the markets of Khorasan and Transoxania. Many towns became known for specific products. Some exported cloth, carpets, prayer mats, metal lamps, saddle equipment, oils, meat, or melons. Others specialized in brocade, silk, paper, glass, brass cauldrons, goblets, horse gear, nuts, high-grade wool, weapons, processed skins, soap, resins, rice, raisins, honey, sulfur, lead, shawls, turbans, cloaks, and numerous other goods. The pattern was one of strong regional specialization and dense commercial interaction. Long-distance caravan trade also expanded greatly in the 9th and 10th centuries. The great overland routes linking China, India, Iran, the Caucasus, Western Asia, and Eastern Europe all passed through Khorasan and Transoxania. Local merchants undertook ambitious journeys and seem to have reached China, India, and Inner Asia. One of the busiest routes was the Great Trans-Asian Road from the lands of the Middle East to China. It passed through Baghdad, Hamadan, Nishapur, Merv, Amul, Bukhara, Samarkand, Usrushana, Chach, Taraz, Balasagun, the southern edge of Lake Issyk-Kul, and onward into Mongolia and northern China. Another important line ran toward Eastern Europe through Merv, Bukhara, Khwarezm, and the Volga route, linking the region with Bulgar, the Khazar lands, and the Rus principalities. Along these routes moved rice, dried fruits, cotton and wool textiles, silk fabrics, silver dirhams, and many other commodities. In return came furs, wax, honey, hides, livestock, and slaves. The discovery of large numbers of Samanid coins far away in northern Russia and the Baltic clearly reflects the intensity of these commercial links. To support this traffic, caravanserais were built along major roads. They provided storage rooms, sleeping quarters, wells, and basic services for merchants and animals. Some caravans were small, others enormous. The largest could involve thousands of pack animals and many thousands of people. Such caravans required drivers, armed guards, and service workers, and they often carried not only merchants, but also artisans, scholars, and envoys. Over time, the nature of trade itself began to shift. Earlier long-distance trade had focused more heavily on luxury items such as jewelry, precious metals, costly weapons, fine vessels, glass, and expensive fabrics. Now, the volume of more practical goods increased. Foodstuffs, raw materials, ordinary craft products, and utilitarian wares became far more prominent in the caravan economy. Under the Samanids, urban life expanded on a broad scale, and with it came a striking flowering of architecture and the decorative arts. The skill reached by builders, designers, and master craftsmen can be seen most clearly in the famous Samanid mausoleum at Bukhara, probably erected in the early 10th century. Built of baked brick, the structure takes the form of a cube crowned by a dome. Its outer corners are marked by engaged, rounded columns, while each of the 4 sides is centered on an arched entrance bay. Inside, the building combines strong, simple masses with an elegant, decorative treatment of the brick surfaces. Its ornament is restrained rather than extravagant, and that restraint is part of its power. The mausoleum preserves echoes of older traditions, yet it also announces something new. A distinctly regional, dynastic style that would shape later architecture in Central Asia. Another major monument from the next stage of this architectural development is the Arab Ati Mausoleum in the village of Tim near Katakurgan. This is a small square building with a single chamber, but its portal is richly decorated and gives it a monumental presence. A related structure is the mausoleum of the last Samanid ruler, Ismail ibn Nuh al-Muntasir, near Kirki. Also square in plan and built of baked brick around the beginning of the 11th century, it is topped by a dome supported through a system of niches and transitional corner elements. Its compact, centrally planned form links it to the earlier Samanid mausoleum in Bukhara, while the projecting entrance front and the decorative treatment of its bricks point toward the later architecture of the 11th century. Together, these buildings show an important transition, from the older centralized domed tomb to the more pronounced portal-centered form that would become increasingly important. They also mark a crucial development in the history of architecture in the region: the growing use of baked brick not just as structure, but as a monumental decorative medium in its own right. Written sources from the time speak of central mosques, tombs, minarets, and covered markets rising in towns across the region. Even so, baked brick was not the only building material. Much construction still relied on raw mud brick. Large adobe buildings of this period survive in places such as Termez and ancient Merv. In Bukhara itself, many structures were timber-framed and built with mud brick. Some of the most remarkable artistic remains from the age survive not in large monuments, but in carved architectural details, especially from the upper Zarafshan region. There, beautifully carved wooden elements such as a mihrab from Iskudar, and columns from settlements like Oberdon, Kurut, Raz, and Fatmev display dense ornamental carving. Their surfaces are filled with plant motifs, scrolling forms, and stylized animals, revealing a strong local taste that remained closely tied to older artistic habits. The decorative arts of the period were equally refined. One of the finest examples comes from the palace of the rulers of Kutal at Hulbuk. There, carved stucco was used to create rich decorative surfaces, ranging from simple rosettes to highly elaborate interlaced and basket-like patterns spread across broad panels. Another remarkable example of this taste appears in a 10th century alabaster panel from Afrasiab, ancient Samarkand. Its design includes trefoil forms, curling leaf stems, circles filled with geometric patterns, and 6-pointed stars. The composition reflects a deeply rooted ornamental tradition that had been developing in Central Asia for centuries and was still very much alive under the Samanids. Ceramic art reached an especially high level. The glazed pottery of Afrasiab from the 9th and 10th centuries stands among the finest artistic achievements of the region. Potters first covered the vessels with a white or red slip, then painted them in black, red, white, or other colours before sealing the design under a transparent glaze that gave the surface a bright, luminous quality. Bowls, dishes, and other vessels were decorated with geometric patterns, plant forms, and often inscriptions carrying blessings, greetings, or wise sayings. In some cases, animals and birds also appeared. These ceramics combine technical refinement with visual clarity and are among the clearest signs of the artistic confidence of the age. Intellectual life in Transoxania and Khorasan also reached an extraordinary level during the 9th and 10th centuries. The Samanids, like many ruling families, needed the support of educated elites, and for that reason they encouraged local cultural traditions, literacy, and literary production. Persian poetry advanced rapidly in this setting. It found some of its earliest and greatest voices in Rudaki, often seen as the father of Persian Tajik poetry, in Firdausi, the great epic poet, and in many others who together shaped a new literary world. Yet poetry was only one aspect of this wider cultural growth. Mathematics, astronomy, geography, chemistry, medicine, history, and philology all flourished. Great scholars emerged whose influence would spread far beyond Central Asia, including figures such as Ibn Sina and al-Biruni. The major cities of the Samanid world became the centres of this intellectual vitality. Bukhara, Samarkand, Balkh, Merv, Nishapur, Khujand, Bunjikat, Hulbuk, and Termez all played important roles. But Bukhara stood above all others. It drew scholars, poets, artists, and men of learning from across the Muslim world and offered them an environment in which creative thought could thrive. A famous library known as the Storehouse of Wisdom was assembled there, holding books on many branches of knowledge, including rare and difficult subjects. The book market of Bukhara was said to contain some of the finest and most unusual works available anywhere in the East. By this time, Persian cultural self-confidence had become much more visible, yet it did not necessarily take the form of rejecting Arab culture. Earlier literary movements had often expressed hostility toward Arab political dominance, and traces of anti-Caliphate or even anti-Islamic feeling could still be found in some circles. But by the 10th century, Persian-speaking scholars and poets increasingly celebrated their own history and cultural identity without denying the value of Arabic learning. What developed under the Samanids was not a closed or hostile civilization, but a Persianate Islamic culture that absorbed, adapted and reworked earlier traditions. Scholarship made especially rapid progress. Historians, geographers, literary scholars and religious thinkers wrote in both Arabic and Persian, and more knowledge began to be expressed in Persian as well. Among the historians of the age were Narshaki, known for his history of Bukhara, and Balami, whose Persian reworking of earlier Arabic historical writing became highly influential. There were also scholars who composed works on geography, legends, and the marvels of distant lands. At the same time, religious scholarship flourished strongly in the northeastern Iranian world. Sunni learning enjoyed active support from the Samanid rulers, and the region became one of the main centers of legal and hadith scholarship. Mathematics and astronomy made particularly important advances. These sciences developed through a combination of practical local knowledge, especially in irrigation and engineering, with the mathematical traditions inherited from Greece and India. Out of that synthesis came breakthroughs that would shape later science in both Asia and Europe. One of the most important figures was Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi, whose name survives in the word algorithm. His work on algebra gave the discipline its name, and he made lasting contributions to solving linear and quadratic equations. Other scholars developed trigonometric methods, improved astronomical tables, wrote influential handbooks, and designed or refined instruments used in observation. Some described the structure of the heavens, others produced major works in geometry and geodesy, and still others laid foundations that later scientists would build upon. Medicine too developed with remarkable energy. Important physicians wrote on anatomy, physiology, disease, treatment, and pharmacology. Some began to write serious medical works in Persian, making knowledge accessible beyond Arabic scholarly circles. Among the great names of the age were Zakaria Razi and other learned physicians who helped shape medieval Islamic medicine. Yet above all stood Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna. Born near Bukhara toward the end of the 10th century, he studied widely from an early age and soon became known as both a scholar and physician. After the fall of the Samanids, he moved through several courts and cities, serving rulers as doctor and administrator before dying in Hamadan. Ibn Sina was one of the greatest thinkers of the medieval world. He was a philosopher, scientist, physician, mathematician, and poet. In an age when religious orthodoxy was powerful, he insisted on the value of observation, reason, and experience. He tried to gather the knowledge of earlier ages, organize it systematically, and extend it further through analysis. His great medical encyclopedia and his vast philosophical works became famous across both the Islamic world and Europe. For centuries, his medical writings were used in teaching and practice. He also wrote in Persian, producing a short encyclopedia that discussed philosophy, logic, mathematics, and astronomy. These works stand among the great monuments of medieval thought. He was also a poet, and in some of his quatrains there appears a note of intellectual freedom unusual for the age. Almost equally impressive was Abu Rayhan al-Biruni, born in Khwarazm. He was another true polymath, writing on mathematics, astronomy, physics, botany, geography, geology, mineralogy, history, chronology, and ethnography. One of his well-known works discusses the calendars of many peoples, including those of Sogdiana and Khwarezm. Another gives a detailed and thoughtful description of India, its learning, and its sciences. He also wrote on astronomy, mathematical geography, minerals, and the measurement of specific weights. His scholarship was encyclopedic, but it was not mere compilation. He approached subjects critically, carefully, and often with unusual precision. Literature grew just as powerfully. The 9th and 10th centuries saw an enormous rise in poetic production. It was during the Samanid period that Persian literature first came fully into its own in Transoxania and Khorasan, rather than farther west in Fars. Arabic literature still retained immense prestige and continued to be cultivated, often with the patronage of the court, and many Central Asian and Khorasanian writers made major contributions in Arabic. But Persian now became an accepted and celebrated literary language. Rudaki stands at the beginning of this tradition. Born in the village of Panjrudak near Panjikent, he was gifted from an early age with a talent for poetry, a fine singing voice, and skill on the harp like Chang. These talents brought him to the Samanid court, where he spent most of his life. Though only a small portion of his work survives, it is enough to show his mastery in the main poetic forms of the age. Another important poet was Shahid Balkhi, who was both a court poet and a man of learning. Dakiki also played a crucial role. He began his literary career under the rulers of Chaghanian and was later called to Bukhara. The literary circles of the Samanid world showed great interest in collecting and reshaping old heroic traditions. And it was in this atmosphere that early prose versions of the Book of Kings were compiled. Dakiki was later ordered to put this epic material into verse, but he was killed before finishing the project. That task was completed on a far greater scale by Ferdowsi, the greatest poet of the age. Born near Tus into a family of modest landed status, he grew up during the rise of the Samanid state. His great ambition was to revive the heroic memory of the Iranian past and turn it into a monumental epic. The result was the Shahnameh, completed first in one version in the late 10th century, and later revised and finished in the early 11th. It was eventually presented to Mahmud of Ghazni, though it was not truly appreciated during the poet's own lifetime. In the Shahnameh, Ferdowsi gave lasting poetic form to the heroic traditions of the Iranian peoples, including older Eastern Iranian groups, such as the Saka, the Sogdians, and the Khwarezmians. He drew on legends of Rustam, Siyavush, Isfandiar, Kaveh, the blacksmith, and Mazdak, among many others. Many of these themes had deep roots in Central Asian artistic and narrative traditions. Scenes connected with Rustam and Siyavush had already appeared in the murals of ancient Panjikent, while carved wood from the palace of the rulers of Usrushana also preserved imagery tied to these heroic cycles. Ferdowsi transformed this material through his own poetic genius, combining written historical tradition, oral legend, and visual memory into a monumental epic. The Shahnameh, written in a strong heroic metre and in a monumental style, became one of the great works of world literature and deeply shaped the later course of Persian literary culture. Music also occupied a central place in this world. The peoples of the eastern Iranian lands had inherited a long musical tradition from antiquity, and under the Samanids that tradition continued to develop. Professional music in oral form flourished, and poetry and music were closely intertwined, often treated as parts of a single art. Many poets were also musicians, singers, and theorists. Rudaki himself was famous not only as a poet, but as a performer on several instruments. Tradition even credits him with improving certain melodies and refining the design of the rud. Other musicians and theorists of the age invented new instruments, composed in established modes, and contributed to the growth of formal musical theory. This music was deeply woven into social life. It was heard at weddings, feasts, festivals, battles, ceremonies, religious observances, and funerals. Historical and poetic sources preserve references to songs of mourning, songs of celebration, military music, and court performance. A wide range of modes and melodies were known, and a rich variety of instruments was in use, including stringed, wind, and percussion instruments. Music was not a minor ornament of elite life. It was part of the rhythm of society itself. At the same time, Sunni Islam became firmly established across most of Central Asia, even though small communities of Zoroastrians, Manichaeans, and Christians still survived. During the first half of the 10th century, Ismaili propaganda also made gains in the region. The movement initially found leadership among military and intellectual circles, and attracted important supporters. For a time, its influence even reached the upper levels of the Samanid state, and it appears that Nasser II may have shown sympathy toward it. This alarmed the Sunni religious elite and sections of the Turkish military guard, who acted against the ruler. Though the plot around the throne was uncovered, the outcome was still the same. Nasser was forced to give way, and his successor carried out a brutal purge of Ismaili sympathizers. The movement did not disappear entirely, but it was pushed underground. By the last decades of the 10th century, the rise of the Ghaznavid Emirat in the lands of present-day Afghanistan marked the end of a long transformation that had already been underway under the Samanids. In earlier generations, political power had depended heavily on the old Iranian landed aristocracy, the local rural elites who had long formed the backbone of regional authority. Over time, however, that balance shifted. Military strength increasingly came to rest in the hands of Turkish slave soldiers, men trained for war and elevated through loyalty, discipline, and personal ability. As long as the Samanid rulers remained strong, they managed to keep these forces under control, and their dominions in Transoxiana and Khorasan were admired for their prosperity and order. Yet, as the authority of the emirs weakened, the state began to fracture. Rival commanders pursued their own ambitions, political factions fought for influence, and the centre steadily lost its grip. Out of that disorder, the Ghaznavid state emerged. Within a relatively short time, it became the strongest power in the Eastern Islamic world, filling the vacuum left by the fading strength of older dynasties. The origins of the Ghaznavids can be traced to the fierce struggles among Turkish generals serving the Samanid court during the middle of the 10th century. One of the most important of these commanders was Alptigin, who held supreme military office in Khorasan and tried, together with powerful allies at court, to shape the succession in Bukhara after the death of the Samanid ruler in 961. That effort failed. A rival faction gained control, and Alptigin found himself pushed aside by the new order. Rather than submit, he withdrew eastward with his own corps of Turkish slave soldiers and a body of Iranian frontier warriors. Officially, this movement could be presented as a campaign against unbelievers on the frontier. But the reality was more practical. Alptigin was securing a refuge, a place where distance and military power might preserve him from enemies at court. He may also have been encouraged by earlier examples of Turkish commanders who had carved out semi-independent principalities in the frontier zones of southeastern Afghanistan, territories that were still nominally tied to the Samanids, but were in practice drifting beyond their reach. Alptigin eventually established himself in the region of Zabulistan, centered on the small town of Ghazna. The Samanid government, unable to enforce direct authority so far from its core lands, had little choice but to recognize the situation and grant him a formal appointment as governor. Local rule in Ghazna had probably been held by a family tied to the neighboring rulers of Kabul and linked culturally and politically to the Indian world. Their hold was not fully broken at once. After Alptegin's death, his son briefly succeeded him, but local resistance resurfaced and the displaced family temporarily regained the town. Even after the Turks returned, their control remained fragile. Other nearby places, such as Gardez, did not fall immediately and had to be fought over. One of Alptegin's successors even lost his life during the struggle to secure the surrounding countryside. What emerged in these years was not a stable kingdom from the beginning, but a hard-won military foothold on a contested frontier. Even so, Turkish power in eastern Afghanistan slowly took deeper root. Coins from the period show that these rulers still acknowledged the Samanid amirs as their formal overlords. But in daily practice they acted with increasing independence. The decisive turning point came in 977, when Sebüktigin took control in Ghazna after the fall of another Turkish commander. Sebüktigin had once been among Alptegin's most trusted military slaves and had accompanied him into Afghanistan. Later, court historians tried to dress his background in noble legend and attach him to ancient royal ancestry. But the truth was almost certainly humbler. He seems to have come from a Turkic background in the region around Ishik Kul, probably from among the Karluk peoples. Stories celebrating his rise under Alptegin present him as a model of personal excellence and royal promise, though such tales were clearly shaped by later admiration. What matters is that once Sebüktigin gained power, he ruled for 20 years and turned a precarious military enclave into the foundation of a lasting state. Formally, Sebüktigin still behaved like a subordinate of the Samanids. He placed their names on coins before his own and used titles that suggested high command rather than kingship. In practice, however, he was building something far more solid. The Turkish military settlers around Ghazna had originally been supported through land assignments drawn from nearby agricultural estates. Sebüktigin tightened this system, bringing revenue more firmly under central supervision and ensuring regular payment for the troops. This was essential because Ghazna remained an exposed and isolated outpost, surrounded by hostile or suspicious powers. To the east lay the Hindu Shahi rulers and the wider political world of northern India, a region to which eastern Afghanistan had long been connected by culture, trade, and history. The Turks of Ghazna could not remain passive if they hoped to survive. Sebüktigin therefore adopted an outward-looking policy that combined self-preservation with expansion. Early in his reign, he moved against rival Turkish rulers in bust and extended his authority into neighbouring territories such as Kustar. More important still were his conflicts with the Hindu Shahis, whose domains stretched across the Kabul Valley and into the Punjab. A counterattack by the ruler Jaipal led to open war, and Sebüktigin's victories brought the regions of Lamgan and the upper Kabul basin under Ghaznavid influence, extending his frontier as far as Peshawar. Religion may have provided useful language for such campaigns, but the driving forces were political and strategic. These wars helped secure the frontier, enlarge the resources of the state, and established a pattern that would later define Ghaznavid policy. Seasonal raids from the Afghan highlands into the wealthy plains of India. Sebüktigin's growing strength also drew him back into the affairs of the Samanid state from which his power had originally sprung. By the 990s, the Samanids were rapidly losing control. Their capital had been threatened by Turkish invaders from Transoxiana, and powerful military leaders within the state were breaking away. Faced with rebellion, the Samanid ruler called on Sebüktigin and his son Mahmud for help. They answered with armed support, swore loyalty, and marched into Khorasan. Their intervention proved decisive. Rebel commanders were defeated and driven westward, and the grateful Samanid ruler rewarded Sebüktigin and Mahmud with grand titles and high office. Mahmud received command in Khorasan, and the Ghaznavids became more deeply entrenched in the region. When fresh invasions from the north followed, the Samanid ruler became still more dependent on them. Sebüktigin and Mahmud were then strong enough not only to defend the state, but to dictate policy, influence ministerial appointments, and shape negotiations with outside powers. The result was clear. Khorasan slipped permanently from Samanid control and into Ghaznavid hands. When Sebüktigin died in 997, the future of this new power briefly became uncertain. He had chosen his younger son Ismail as successor in Ghazna, perhaps because of family ties that linked him more closely to Alptegin's house. Mahmud, however, was already a proven commander with strong support among the military elite. He moved quickly, returned east, defeated his brother, and seized power. Soon afterward, he secured formal recognition from the weakening Samanids for the lands that now made up his real base of authority, including Afghanistan and eastern Khorasan. He also recovered western Khorasan from rival commanders, and by 999 he stood as master of the entire region south of the Oxus. At this point, he no longer acted like a provincial governor. He sought and obtained recognition from the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, presenting himself as the Caliph's loyal champion. This relationship became central to Ghaznavid rule. From then on, Ghaznavid sultans carefully linked their legitimacy to caliphal approval, sent rich gifts taken in war to Baghdad, and cultivated the image of defenders of Sunni Islam against both internal heresy and external enemies. At the same moment, a major political change was unfolding across Central Asia. The Karakhanids occupied Bukhara and brought the Samanid Emirat to an inglorious end. An agreement set the Oxus as the boundary between Karakhanid and Ghaznavid power. This settlement carried enormous long-term significance, even if contemporaries did not fully grasp it. From this point onward, the northeastern Islamic world was dominated by Turkish dynasties, rather than Iranian ones. Over time, the region became increasingly open to migration from the inner Asian steppes. The demographic and linguistic balance of many lands would slowly change. Areas once shaped above all by Eastern Iranian traditions would, over the centuries, become increasingly Turkish in population, culture, and speech. These movements also altered patterns of land use, pastoralism, and agriculture across Transoxiana and neighbouring regions. Mahmud's reign lasted more than 3 decades, and during those years he transformed the Ghaznavid state into a vast military empire. What had begun as a frontier principality in Afghanistan expanded westward toward the fringes of Azerbaijan and Kurdistan, eastward into the Ganges basin, northward toward Khwarazm and the Upper Oxus, and southward to the coasts of Sind and Makran. No ruler since the height of the Abbasid Caliphate had commanded so wide a stretch of territory from such an unlikely capital. Ghazna, once obscure, became a centre of power known across the Islamic world and beyond. That rise was made possible by several factors. Mahmud inherited not only his father's Afghan base, but also the manpower and revenues of Khorasan. The province's rich agricultural lands, thriving cities, and commercial wealth gave him the income needed to maintain a permanent and expensive army. Turkish slave soldiers remained the core of that force, but successful campaigning also attracted volunteers, free warriors, and adventurers eager to share in victory and plunder. For Mahmud, securing Khorasan and defending the Oxus frontier were vital priorities. Even after a treaty with the Karakhanids and marriage ties between the ruling houses, the danger from the north remained constant. Karakhanid rulers coveted Khorasan, and more than once they invaded while Mahmud was campaigning elsewhere. In one such moment, when he was absent in India, Karakhanid forces swept down on Balkh and Nishapur. Some local people, worn down by Ghaznavid tax demands, even welcomed them. Mahmud rushed back and restored his position. A second invasion followed, but this too was repelled. In a major battle near Balkh, the Ghaznavid use of war elephants helped shatter enemy morale, since the Kara Khanid troops were unaccustomed to facing such animals in combat. After this defeat, the Kara Khanids no longer posed the same unified danger. Their political structure was divided and unstable, and Mahmud skillfully exploited rivalries among them, using diplomacy and marriage alliances to keep them off balance. One of the most serious northern rivals was a Kara Khanid prince who dominated Bukhara and Samarkand, and resisted Ghaznavid ambitions in Transoxiana for years. Mahmud campaigned against him and briefly drove him from Samarkand, but chose not to pursue total conquest there. It suited him to leave rival powers competing with one another, rather than allow any one of them to grow too strong. These northern campaigns also enhanced his prestige, far beyond the immediate frontiers of his empire. Reports survive of embassies arriving from distant eastern lands, including rulers of Central and East Asian regions, who sought diplomatic or marital ties with him. Mahmud declined alliances with non-Muslim rulers, but the very arrival of such embassies shows how far his reputation had spread. Mahmud's ability to project power north of the Oxus was strengthened by his absorption of Khwarezm. This ancient Iranian kingdom had long maintained a degree of independence thanks to its fertile oasis economy and its strategic isolation among deserts and steppes. Mahmud first sought influence there through marriage, binding its ruling house to his own family. Then, by exploiting internal tensions and intervening in local politics, he found a pretext for military action. In 1017 he invaded, overthrew the ruling line, and brought Khwarezm into his empire. This conquest ended yet another surviving Iranian dynasty and placed the region under Turkish governors, loyal to Ghazna. From then on, Khwarezm became both a frontier zone and a bridgehead for operations deeper into Central Asia. Elsewhere in Afghanistan and Baluchistan, Mahmud extended control in different ways depending on local conditions. In some places, he allowed local rulers to remain as vassals after they acknowledged his authority. In other regions, especially where geography made direct control more practical, he absorbed territories completely. Rulers in parts of northern Afghanistan were deposed and their lands annexed. Yet some remote areas remained difficult to subdue. Gur, in the mountains of central Afghanistan, was one of them. Expeditions were sent there, and certain local chiefs submitted, but effective control remained shallow. Islam spread slowly in that region, and the highlands preserved a strong degree of independence. This would matter greatly in the future, because the same mountainous zone later produced the Ghurids, the dynasty that eventually replaced the Ghaznavids. Sistan presented another challenge. It had long traditions of autonomy and still retained the legacy of earlier local dynasties. Its ruler tried repeatedly to resist Ghaznavid encroachment, taking advantage of moments of succession, struggle, and external distraction. Mahmud responded with force, invaded more than once, and finally deposed the local ruler, annexing the province. Yet the people of Sistan never accepted Ghaznavid rule wholeheartedly. Resentment remained strong, and later, when Ghaznavid power weakened, the region would again slip away from their control. The most famous part of Mahmud's career, however, lies in his repeated campaigns into India. These expeditions became legendary in later memory, but their real character is clearer when viewed in context. The first major obstacle was the Hindu Shahi kingdom, which controlled the approaches to the Punjab and stood in the way of expansion from Afghanistan into northern India. Mahmud defeated Jaipal, then his successors, and eventually broke the power of the dynasty altogether. Coalitions of Indian rulers tried to resist him, but one after another, they failed. As the Hindu Shahis collapsed, the road into the plains opened wider. Mahmud then launched a series of expeditions deeper into India, targeting wealthy towns, strongholds, and temple centres. He attacked places in the Punjab, Rajasthan, the Ganges-Yamuna plain, and central India. The rewards were immense: gold, silver, jewels, slaves, elephants, and prestige. Among these campaigns, the attack on Somnath became the most celebrated. The expedition required a difficult march across arid country and a dangerous return through hostile terrain. But the scale of the treasure seized made it one of the most famous raids of the age. News of the victory spread across the Islamic world. Rich gifts were sent westward, and Mahmud's reputation as a champion of Islam rose still higher. Over time, stories grew around the event until it took on an almost mythic place in historical memory. Yet the Indian campaigns were not attempts to convert the subcontinent, or to impose direct rule over all the lands reached by Ghaznavid armies. In most cases, they were raids for plunder, tribute, and military advantage. Mahmud sought wealth, elephants, slaves, and acknowledgement of supremacy from local rulers. Temple treasures were especially attractive because they could be melted down, reused, or displayed in Ghazna to enhance royal magnificence. No durable program of mass conversion lay behind these expeditions, and none could realistically have been enforced. Once Ghaznavid forces withdrew, any coerced submission would have dissolved. Only in western Punjab, close to already existing Muslim communities in the Indus Basin, did a more lasting process of Islamic expansion begin to take root. Even there, attempts to establish a stable provincial administration met serious limits because the region remained militarized and unstable. Mahmud's religious image was therefore both sincere and political. He presented himself as a defender of Sunni orthodoxy and an enemy of heresy, paganism, and rival claimants to religious leadership. This posture shaped his actions not only in India but also in Muslim lands. In Multan, where local rulers and communities had come under the influence of Shiite currents linked to the Fatimids, Mahmud intervened militarily, crushed opposition, massacred sectarian opponents, and imposed his own authority. Religious justification was openly invoked, but financial motives were present as well. Wealthy commercial centres could be punished in the name of orthodoxy, while also being forced to enrich the treasury. This mixture of piety, politics, and profit was typical of Ghaznavid imperial practice. The same pattern appeared in Mahmud's final western campaign. The ruler of Rai, unable to manage his own forces, appealed for help. Mahmud seized the opportunity. He marched into northern Iran, deposed the local ruler, plundered the city, and justified the conquest by portraying it as a blow against heresy and disorder. Control of Rai opened the door to further influence in western Iran and seemed to promise even larger ambitions. Armies were sent onward, and for a moment it appeared that the Ghaznavids might extend their power deep into the Iranian plateau. But these gains proved fragile. They had been won by a ruler of exceptional energy and military skill, and they could not easily be held together after his death. When Mahmud died in 1030, the throne briefly passed to his son Muhammad, in accordance with his wishes. But the empire had been built by war, and in such a state the loyalties of soldiers and officials mattered more than testamentary preference. Mahmud's other son, Masud, returned from the west with the army, and support for Muhammad collapsed. The leading men of the empire quickly judged that Masud, the more experienced commander, was better suited to preserve what had been won. Yet this choice did not solve the deeper problem. Masud inherited an empire too large, too exposed, and too dependent on constant military success. He was brave, but less capable in judgment than his father. he also mistrusted many of the senior officials who had served under Mahmud and replaced them with men more pliant and less experienced. This change weakened the quality of decision-making at the centre just when the empire faced mounting danger. At first, Massoud tried to continue the established policies of expansion and domination. He campaigned in India, attempted to hold recent gains in Iran, and dealt with rebellious vassals. But the structure of the empire was already under strain. India absorbed enormous attention because it had become essential to the flow of plunder and tribute that sustained the state. Meanwhile, new threats gathered in the west and north. The Karakhanids were still active across the Oxus, but an even greater danger was emerging in the form of Turkmen groups moving into Khwarezm and northern Iran. These newcomers were not merely raiders. They represented a new wave of steppe power that would transform the balance of the region. Massoud did try to manage relations with neighbouring rulers through diplomacy, marriages, and military interventions. He campaigned into Transoxiana, supported rival princes, and relied on experienced commanders to secure the northern frontier. Yet this system began to break down. Important governors turned hostile, alliances shifted, and the death or assassination of key figures left dangerous gaps. Khwarezm slipped from Ghaznavid control, and along the Oxus frontier new enemies pressed harder. The Ghaznavids could no longer respond with the same speed or effectiveness that had marked Mahmud's reign. The final collapse of Ghaznavid power in the west cannot be understood without the arrival of the Seljuks. Their rise changed the balance of the Eastern Islamic world. Long before, they built an empire of their own. Oghuz Turkic groups from the steppe zone north of Transoxiana had already been moving steadily southward. During the last years of the Samanids, these nomadic groups entered the politics of the region as shifting allies, sometimes supporting the weakened Samanid rulers, sometimes serving the ambitions of the Karakhanids, who replaced them. By the early 11th century, many of these Oghuz had, at least outwardly, accepted Islam, but their political loyalties remained fluid and depended above all on opportunity, pasture, and plunder. These Oghuz groups became especially important in the struggles around Bukhara. Their support helped certain local rulers hold power in Transoxiana when stronger enemies tried to dislodge them. At one stage, after pressure from Mahmud of Ghazana and one of his allies in the northeast, several thousand Oghuz families, who had once followed Arslan Israel, sought permission to enter Ghaznavid territory and settle in the pastures of northern Khorasan. They promised to defend the frontier against later nomadic attacks, presenting themselves as useful border guardians. This promise soon proved hollow. Instead of stabilizing the frontier, these groups became a new source of disorder. Ghaznavid troops had to move repeatedly against Oghuz raiders, who were plundering districts across northern Iran. Meanwhile, other branches of the Seljuk family remained north of the Oxus, deeply involved in the politics of Khwarezm. When pressure there increased, they too moved south into Ghaznavid territory. By the middle of the 1030s, the Seljuk leaders had entered Khorasan in force. Their arrival was disastrous for the settled lands. Their herds stripped the cultivated zones around the oasis towns, damaging fields, irrigation systems, and food supply. Their mounted bands also interfered with trade routes that linked the Eastern Islamic world to Central Asia, Iran, and beyond. The Ghaznavids sent armies against them, but these campaigns brought no lasting solution. The Seljuks were mobile, adaptable, and difficult to pin down. Their style of warfare was very different from that of the Ghaznavid state. While the Sultan relied on a conventional army built around heavily armed cavalry, infantry, and formal lines of command, the Turkmen bands fought with speed, dispersion, and constant movement. Town after town in Khorasan began to lose faith in Ghaznavid protection. By the late 1030s, major cities such as Ray, Merv, and Nishapur were willing to open their gates to the Seljuks, rather than continue trusting a distant ruler who could not guarantee their safety. Masud, who had spent too much of his reign focused on India, was finally forced to turn his full attention westward. He marched toward Khorasan with the main Ghaznavid army, but he was already reacting too late to a crisis that had matured over several years. In 1040, the decisive encounter took place at Dandankan, in the desert zone between Merv and Sarax. There, a relatively small Seljuk force defeated the far more cumbersome Ghaznavid army. The result was one of the great turning points in medieval Islamic history. After Dandankan, the Seljuks declared that they recognized no earthly overlord except the Caliph in Baghdad. In the decades that followed, they seized control of nearly all Iran and made it the heart of a new imperial order. The Ghaznavids, by contrast, lost their western provinces one after another. Eventually, the frontier hardened along a line that roughly divided the territory of modern Afghanistan from north to south. From that moment on, the Ghaznavid world turned away from Iran and Central Asia and faced increasingly toward India. In fact, the dynasty's last phase was centered not in Ghazna, but in Lahore. Later, rulers made occasional efforts to resist this transformation. Masud's son, Maudud, was the last Ghaznavid ruler to attempt coordinated action with the Karakhanids against the Seljuks. Even after that, control of the Upper Oxus lands remained a source of friction between the two powers. Under Ibrahim, there were continued disputes over frontier regions, but the larger reality had changed for good. By the 12th century, rulers such as Bahram Shah survived only by accepting a loose dependence on the great Seljuks. Even that was not enough to preserve the dynasty forever. In time, a new power rose out of the mountains of central Afghanistan, the Ghurids, and they would bring the Ghaznavid story to its final end. Looking back, the vast empire assembled by Mahmud appears too large and too fragile to survive once the Seljuk pressure became overwhelming. Ghazna's administration could not maintain firm contact with distant provinces such as northern Iran and Khwarezm. Once rebellion, invasion, and local disaffection combined. Communications failed, loyalty weakened, and the outer provinces slipped away. Yet there is another side to this collapse. By losing its western lands, the Ghaznavid state was reduced to a more compact and manageable size. This contraction may actually have prolonged its life. Stripped of its broad western empire, it continued for nearly a century and a half more before the Ghurids finally extinguished it in 1186. For a medieval Islamic dynasty born from military expansion, that was still a substantial lifespan. The Ghaznavid state itself was a striking example of a wider historical pattern. A ruling house that had begun with Turkish military slaves rapidly transformed itself into a monarchy operating within the deeply rooted traditions of the Iranian and Islamic world. These rulers governed a realm made up of many peoples: Persians, Turks, Afghans, Indians, and others. In a period before modern nationalism, such diversity was not automatically seen as a weakness. On the contrary, rulers valued the different skills that varied groups could contribute. Even so, the Ghaznavid sultans never forgot that their own political survival ultimately rested on Turkish military support. Their core armed following was Turkish, and they had to satisfy that military class through pay, honour, success in war, and access to plunder. When Masud appeared shaken after the disaster at Dandankan, the army quickly lost confidence in him. That reaction reveals how personal military leadership remained at the centre of Ghaznavid kingship. At the same time, military strength alone could not run an empire. For administration, taxation, record-keeping, and diplomacy, the Ghaznavids depended heavily on their Iranian subjects, especially the educated secretarial class. These officials drew on traditions that reached back beyond Islam itself into the old bureaucratic culture of pre-Islamic Iran. To that older heritage had been added the political language of Islamic rule, with its emphasis on divine favour, justice, and obedience to sacred law. In practice, however, the balance was uneven. The ruler was expected to defend religion and protect order, but government often operated in a harsh and authoritarian manner. What emerged under the Ghaznavids was a state in which the Sultan, his army and his civilian servants stood above the mass of ordinary subjects. Society was not bound together by patriotism or shared national feeling. Most people were primarily concerned with their own town, village, trade, or family. Their duty was to pay taxes and submit. In return, the ruling power was supposed to provide security, though even that protection could be uncertain. This divide between ruler and ruled defined the nature of Ghaznavid government. The people were expected to obey and to fear. Contemporary political attitudes made little attempt to soften that principle. Subjects existed to sustain the state financially, while the army and the ruling elite existed to preserve power. These two spheres were not supposed to blend. There are even episodes showing that resistance by townspeople against invaders could be criticized if such resistance damaged the Sultan's interests. Submission, not civic heroism, was often what rulers expected from their populations. Mas'ud's decision late in life to abandon Ghazna and turn toward India, leaving officials to make terms with incoming enemies, was entirely in keeping with this political mentality. The central and provincial administration was staffed largely by Persian-speaking officials, often called Tajiks in the sources. At the top stood the vizier, who coordinated government and oversaw the larger machinery of rule. The Ghaznavids had access to some of the finest administrators and secretaries of their age. Their bureaucracy was divided into several major offices, handling matters such as the vizierate, the chancery, military administration, intelligence and the postal network, and the management of the royal household. Yet all of this machinery served one overriding goal: the extraction and distribution of resources. The standing army was enormously expensive. Campaigning required transport, provisions, weapons, pay, horses, and constant preparation. Court life was also costly. Palaces, gardens, public buildings, patronage, ceremonial generosity, and royal display consumed huge sums. As the empire expanded, the bureaucracy itself grew larger and more expensive. The result was permanent pressure on the vizier to find new revenue and enforce old claims more ruthlessly. That pressure made office dangerous. A vizier who failed to keep money flowing risked dismissal, imprisonment, torture, or death. Several of the chief ministers who served under Mahmud, Muhammad, and Mas'ud met violent or miserable ends. The Sultan expected results and trusted few people completely. Provincial governors and local officials were likewise kept under suspicion, especially because those posted far from the capital might withhold taxes, build local support, or drift toward independence. To prevent this, the Ghaznavid state relied on a network of messengers, informants, and inspectors. Surveillance was woven into administration. It was a world of constant anxiety, where both failure and excessive independence could be fatal. The burden placed on the population was therefore severe. Tax collectors were often harsh, but matters could become even worse when military officers or soldiers were assigned rights to collect revenue directly. In such cases, those who extracted taxes had every reason to squeeze as much as possible from the people. Towns that had once welcomed Ghaznavid intervention later turned bitterly against them because of this oppression. In places such as Ray and parts of Khorasan, resentment against fiscal abuse weakened public willingness to resist the Seljuks. When new conquerors arrived, many urban communities no longer felt that Ghaznavid rule was worth defending. The administrative office responsible for correspondence played an important role in such a centralized state. It handled communication with provincial governors and foreign rulers alike. Messages announcing victories, requesting alliance, or setting out royal claims were composed in an elevated and highly formal style. But in a military empire like the Ghaznavid one, the office dealing with army administration was even more crucial. It organized recruitment, inspection, supply, pay, and the movement of equipment. The army itself was not only a fighting force, but also a ceremonial instrument of kingship. On major festivals and official occasions, military reviews displayed the power and splendor of the state before envoys, courtiers, and subjects. These parades projected order, wealth, and discipline, reinforcing the image of the Sultan as victorious ruler and master of a formidable war machine. At the core of that machine stood the Turkish slave soldiers. The most elite among them served as palace guards, protecting the ruler and the inner court. They were richly dressed and equipped, and surviving artistic remains from Ghaznavid sites confirm the luxurious image described in written accounts. From this palace, core came many household officials and ceremonial attendants. Beyond them stood the broader body of Turkish military slaves, who formed the backbone of the army. The Ghaznavids were continuing a military tradition already well established in the Islamic world, one that had first been developed under the Abbasids, and then adopted by later dynasties. Turkish troops were valued for their toughness, their skill on horseback, and especially their use of the bow in mounted warfare. In theory, they were loyal to the ruler who owned and rewarded them, though in practice their loyalty could waver when success failed. These Turkish troops came from several different steppe backgrounds, though the sources are often vague. Some were obtained through slave markets in Transoxiana. Others arrived as diplomatic gifts from allied rulers. The army also included free Arab and Kurdish cavalry, known for mobility and aggression in battle, and Dalamite infantry, who fought in their own distinctive style. Indian troops were present as well, some probably enslaved, others perhaps serving in return for reward or submission. Their role may at times have been to balance the power of the Turkish element. The famous war elephants of the Ghaznavids also deserve attention. Taken from India as tribute or booty, these animals restored to the Eastern Islamic world a form of warfare not seen there since late pre-Islamic times. On the battlefield, they could have a devastating psychological effect, especially on enemies unfamiliar with them. In religious terms, the Ghaznavid rulers projected a strongly Sunni and Orthodox image. They worked hard to be seen as defenders of Islam against both internal heterodoxy and external unbelief. Yet the personal faith of men like Mahmud and Masood is harder to measure. They were perfectly capable of enjoying courtly pleasures, including drinking parties, while still presenting themselves as champions of religion. What mattered most was their recognition that the official religious establishment was politically useful and socially important. The learned scholars, judges, and legal authorities of Sunni Islam gave the state moral backing and helped legitimize its power. The Ghaznavids showed particular favor toward the Hanafi school of law, which had deep roots in the Eastern Islamic world. Prominent families of scholars were patronized, appointed to legal and teaching offices, and sometimes entrusted with diplomacy as well as religion. Royal support for Sunni institutions was part of a larger movement that had been gathering force across the Islamic world in response to the spread of Shiite power and influence during the 10th century. Colleges for religious learning had already begun to appear in increasing numbers, and these institutions trained judges, scholars, teachers, and administrators in orthodox doctrine. The Ghaznavids encouraged this process because it strengthened both Sunni identity and state authority. Like many rulers of the period, they were also drawn to the presence of holy men and mystics. At the same time, They were aware that the world of religious charisma included frauds and exaggerations, as well as genuine spiritual figures. Their support seems to have gone more naturally towards sober and respectable religious circles than toward flamboyant wonder workers. Culturally, the Ghaznavids understood that royal power in the Islamic world required more than soldiers and taxes. A legitimate court was expected to be a centre of learning, literature, and patronage. Poets praised the ruler, scholars enhanced the prestige of the capital, and royal generosity displayed civilization as well as strength. Mahmud, in particular, seems to have modelled his court partly on the older Samanid ideal, which had been famous for its encouragement of Persian literature. Whether or not later stories exaggerated the sheer number of poets at his court, there is no doubt that Ghazna became a major literary centre. Some of the finest lyric poets of New Persian flourished there, praising the Sultan, celebrating victory, and shaping a courtly style that would endure long after the Ghaznavids themselves had vanished. There are even traces suggesting that Turkish poetic traditions were also known within the courtly world. Still, this patronage should not be romanticised too much. Royal support for scholars and writers did not always spring from pure admiration for learning. Great rulers wanted brilliant men near them because prestige itself was a political resource. Intellectuals could glorify the dynasty, elevate the fame of the capital, and attach refinement to military power. Sometimes scholars were summoned not by invitation but by pressure. Some accepted the opportunities offered by the Ghaznavid court, while others preferred to flee elsewhere rather than serve under compulsion. Even the greatest minds associated with the Ghaznavid age do not always appear to have enjoyed close personal ties with Mahmud himself. Yet the court undeniably created conditions in which literary and scholarly production could flourish. Royal spending on palaces, gardens, entertainments, and ceremonial display was immense. Some of this extravagance had a political purpose. The army and bureaucracy were held together not only by pay, but by visible favour, honour, gifts, and the constant display of royal magnificence. Court life was therefore an important part of governance. Clothing, robes of honour, court festivals, and formal receptions all reinforced hierarchy and loyalty. The ruler's public life was carefully staged and sharply separated from his private domestic life within the harem. Much of the physical splendour of Ghaznavid court culture has vanished, especially in the harsh environment of Afghanistan. But the surviving remains of their palatial architecture show that their building projects were conceived on a grand scale. For the ordinary population, however, daily life was very different. The surviving written sources come overwhelmingly from elite circles, so only fragments reveal the experience of peasants, traders, and craftsmen. Even so, those fragments are enough to show that taxation weighed heavily. Land tax was only part of the burden. There were also many local tolls, dues, and irregular demands. Forced labour could be imposed for building projects or for royal hunting expeditions. Such obligations placed a heavy cost on rural communities, and practices of this kind survived in Iranian and Afghan lands for centuries afterward. Agriculture was concentrated in the oases and irrigated zones. Most production was local and aimed at sustaining nearby settlements or supplying the towns. The environment of Afghanistan and Khorasan offered only limited possibilities for large-scale farming. Apart from a few significant rivers, much of the cultivated land depended on underground channels and irrigation systems that required major investment and regular maintenance. Only wealthier landholders or the state itself could afford to build and repair such works. In some upland regions, dry farming was possible, while the upper Oxus zones were famous for excellent pastures and horse breeding. But in general, the agricultural base of the Ghaznavid lands was narrow and vulnerable. This helps explain why control of prosperous provinces, like Khorasan, mattered so much to the dynasty. Industry likewise remained small in scale and mostly served local needs. Artisans and craftsmen produced textiles, carpets, and other goods for consumption in their own towns or districts. Yet certain urban centres, especially in Khorasan, became known for particular fabrics and luxury goods that travelled beyond the province. These towns also had an internal social structure of their own. Prominent local families supplied judges, preachers, scholars, and community leaders. Municipal life had its own notables who acted as intermediaries between local society and the central state. Families of this kind often combined religious prestige, administrative office, and commercial wealth. Trade was one of the great connective forces of the Ghaznavid world. Caravan routes linked Khorasan and Afghanistan to Transoxiana, the steppe, Iraq, and the wider Middle East. When Oghuz and Seljuk incursions disrupted these routes, many towns in Khorasan became more willing to accept new rulers who seemed capable of restoring order. Among the commodities moving along these roads were slaves. For centuries, Turkish slaves had passed southward through Khorasan toward the central lands of Islam. Others came through the upper Oxus lands with the involvement of neighbouring Turkish rulers. Indian campaigns added another stream of human and material wealth. Slaves, precious metals, crafted objects, trophies, and captured images were brought back to Ghazna from the subcontinent. Some of these spoils were displayed in palaces and mosques, some were melted down or transformed into usable wealth, and some required specialists to assess and convert them into coin or bullion. This is important because Ghaznavid coinage was one of the notable features of their economy. The quality of their gold and silver issues suggests a state deeply invested in turning conquest into monetary power. Plunder from India, taxation from Khorasan, and commercial wealth from the caravan routes all fed into a fiscal system that circulated money across a wide region. In that sense, Ghaznavid military expansion stimulated economic activity, even as it imposed great suffering on many subject populations. In the end, the Ghaznavid Sultanate marked the first great breakthrough of Turkish political power in the Eastern Islamic world over older Iranian dynasties and regional elites. The empire built by its early rulers proved too large to endure in its original form, but its long-term impact was profound. By weakening or destroying local dynasties, by reducing the old landed classes, and by strengthening the model of centralized rule from a royal court, the Ghaznavids cleared the path for later powers, such as the great Seljuks and the Khwarezm Shahs. The political form they developed, a centralized military monarchy standing above a taxed and dependent population, became a lasting pattern in the history of many later Islamic states. Their empire did not survive intact, but the structure of power they helped create outlived them by centuries.